What's up, guys? Welcome to No Harry, we've got something special today. What if McGonagall's detection charm found 34 memory blocks on Harry and she arrested Dumbledore live? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Charm That Changed Everything. The Sorting Hat had barely been put away when McGonagall stood up. Most of the first years were still buzzing from the sorting, whispering to their new housemates, craning their necks at the enchanted ceiling, sneaking glances at the ghost floating serenely above the Hufflepuff table. Harry was doing all three simultaneously, still slightly stunned that a talking hat had decided the course of his life by shouting a single word. Ron had leaned over to explain about the feast that was coming, and Hermione had already begun cataloging the house point system with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for this moment her entire life. None of them were paying attention to McGonagall. They should have been. She had moved to the center of the staff table, standing rather than sitting, her posture ramrod straight in a way that somehow communicated this was not part of the evening's scheduled programming. In her hand was a small bronze instrument, disc-shaped, the size of a pocket watch, engraved with concentric circles that caught the candlelight and threw it back in thin copper lines. She tapped it once with her wand and it rose from her palm and hung in the air at eye level, spinning slowly. "Before we begin the feast," she said, her voice carrying across the hall with the practiced ease of a woman who had never once needed to raise it to command a room, "I will be conducting the standard safeguarding assessment for all first-year students. This is a new policy implemented by the Board of Governors in partnership with the Department of Magical Child Welfare. It is quick, painless, and entirely routine." Dumbledore, seated at the center of the staff table in robes the color of deep plum, smiled the benevolent smile he wore like a second face. "As Professor McGonagall says," he added, lacing his fingers together. "Merely a formality." Something flickered across McGonagall's expression, there and gone, too fast to name. She turned back to the first years. "When I call your name, you will remain seated. The charm will pass over you and take less than 5 seconds. Please do not attempt to interfere with the instrument." She raised her wand. The bronze disc pulsed once, a warm amber glow, and the charm began moving slowly down the Gryffindor table. Hannah Abbott, a soft green shimmer. Normal. Susan Bones, green. Normal. Terry Boot, green. Normal. The charm moved with quiet efficiency, each child tagged and cleared in seconds, the disc's glow steady and calm. A few students shifted nervously as it passed over them, but the glow never changed. Green, 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 green. The hall was beginning to relax into it, treating it the way students treat any administrative procedure, with mild curiosity that fades quickly into boredom. Harry wasn't watching the disc. He was watching a plate of roast chicken that had appeared at the end of the Hufflepuff table and was trying to calculate how long this process would take before he could eat. The Dursleys had given him half a piece of toast before putting him on the train this morning, which he suspected was their way of celebrating his departure. Harry Potter. He looked up. McGonagall's eyes found his immediately, sharp, green-gray, the color of slate after rain. There was something in them he couldn't read. A quality of attention that felt different from the way adults usually looked at him, which was either with the bright, overeager excitement of someone meeting a celebrity, or the carefully managed wariness of someone trying not to stare. This was neither. This was the look of someone who was watching very carefully because they needed to see exactly what happened next. "Here," Harry said, which was slightly redundant since she was clearly looking directly at him, but it was the thing you said. The bronze disc moved toward him. It was 3 feet away when the color changed. Not gradually. Not subtly. The amber glow snapped out and something else came in, a deep, thrumming red that pulsed like a second heartbeat, and the disc began to spin faster. The concentric circles on its surface lit up one by one, not smoothly but in sharp successive flashes, like a machine exceeding its intended parameters. McGonagall's hand tightened on her wand. 5 circles lit. 10. The disc was spinning so fast now it was barely visible, just a copper blur with light bleeding off it in thin red lines. Harry stared at it. He didn't feel anything, no pain, no pressure, no sense that something was happening to him specifically. But the disc was behaving like it had suddenly discovered something that required its full and urgent attention. 15 circles. 20. Someone at the Slytherin table said, "What's it doing?" 25. 30. The hall had gone completely silent. Not the anticipatory silence before an announcement, but the struck dumb silence of a room full of people simultaneously realizing something is wrong. Even the ghosts had stilled. Even the candles seemed to be burning lower, though that was probably imagination. 32. 33. McGonagall said, very quietly, "Merlin." 34. The disc stopped spinning. In the absolute silence of the great hall, the sound of it stopping was somehow louder than anything that had come before, a sharp cessation, like a held breath finally released. The 34 circles blazed steady red, each one tagged with a faint secondary glow that pulsed in a specific, recognizable pattern. A magical signature. The same signature, repeated 34 times, each instance branded into a different part of Harry Potter's mind. McGonagall turned. She turned slowly, the way people move when they're giving themselves a last moment before they do something they can't undo. Her eyes traveled from the disc to the staff table. To the man in plum robes with the half-moon spectacles and the long silver beard who was watching the disc with an expression of profound, unreadable calm. "That signature," she said. Her voice had changed. The professional distance was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more frightening, the tone of a woman who has just had a suspicion confirmed that she spent years hoping was wrong. "That signature is yours, Albus." The hall didn't react. Not yet. The students were still processing what they'd seen, still trying to make the picture fit into a frame they understood, and most of them didn't know enough about magical signatures or detection charms to understand what 34 red circles meant. But the staff did. Several of them had gone very still in the way that people go still when they're afraid that any movement might make something worse. Dumbledore looked at McGonagall with eyes that were the calm blue of deep water. "Minerva," he said, and the word was gentle, almost fond. "Perhaps we should discuss 34 memory blocks." McGonagall walked toward him. Not rushing, each step deliberate, like she was laying down stones. 34, Albus. Each one bearing your signature. Each one embedded in an 11-year-old child. She stopped at the end of the staff table, 4 feet away from him, and her wand was in her hand. Harry hadn't seen her draw it. Memory modification of a minor is a Class A violation of the Magical Child Welfare Act. Deliberate cognitive suppression with intent, which those blocks indicate, given their number and depth, carries a mandatory hearing before the Wisengamot. "Minerva." Dumbledore's voice was still patient. Still kind. That was somehow the most unsettling thing about him. He sounded like he was about to offer her a lemon drop and explain everything in a way that would make it all make sense. "These are extraordinary circumstances that require context. I am placing you under arrest." The words hit the room like a stone hitting still water. The ripples went everywhere at once. The Slytherin table erupted first, not in protest but in pure shock, the kind of uproar that comes from witnessing something that has fundamentally broken the established order of the world. Draco Malfoy was on his feet without apparently deciding to stand. Pansy Parkinson had her hand over her mouth. At the Gryffindor table, someone, Ron, as it turned out, said, "Bloody hell," in a voice that was meant to be a whisper but came out at approximately the volume of a foghorn. Hermione had her hand pressed flat against the table and was leaning forward like she was trying to read small print from a distance. Harry sat very still in the middle of all of it. He wasn't sure what he felt. He kept waiting for a feeling, shock, or confusion, or some instinct to object, but what came instead was something stranger and harder to name. A kind of stillness. As if some part of him that had been running a constant, low-grade process in the background had just been told it could stop. He looked at the disc still hanging in the air beside his head, its 34 circles still blazing red. He looked at his own hands, flat against the wooden table. He thought, 34. Dumbledore stood. Not in a hurry. Not in alarm. He stood the way a man stands at the end of a long meeting when it's finally time to go home, with a certain settled inevitability, like this was a scene in a play he had already read to the end and knew how it concluded. Minerva, he said, and now there was something else in his voice. Not quite sadness. Something more complex than that. I want you to understand that everything I have done has been in service of a future that I believe, that I know, is necessary for the survival of this world. I don't doubt you believe that, McGonagall said. Her wand didn't waver. That's what worries me most. She flicked her wand twice, sharp, precise movements. 2 silver bindings appeared at Dumbledore's wrists, not tight, not punitive, just present and visible. The room saw them and the noise climbed another register. Professor Flitwick had gone the color of chalk. Professor Sprout was gripping the edge of the table with both hands. Snape, at the far end of the staff table, was watching the scene with an expression that was absolutely unreadable, not surprised, not horrified, not smug. Just watching, with the focused stillness of a man cataloging information. The detection charm's results are automatically transmitted to the Department of Magical Child Welfare upon completion, McGonagall continued, still addressing Dumbledore directly, as if the 400 students watching didn't exist. They will have received the report before I finish this sentence. Aurors will be here within the hour. She paused. I suggest you do not attempt to leave. I have no intention of leaving, Dumbledore said mildly. No, McGonagall agreed. I didn't think you would. She turned then, and for the first time since the disc had lit up, she looked at Harry. Really looked at him, the way she'd looked at the disc, with careful, precise attention, like she was taking an inventory of damage. Mr. Potter, she said. Her voice had shifted again. The official hardness was still there, but there was something layered beneath it now, something that, in a less composed woman, might have been called anguish. Are you all right? Harry opened his mouth. Closed it. Tried again. I don't really know what just happened. I know. She crossed the room toward him, and the students on either side of him automatically made space. That's part of the problem. She crouched slightly so she was at eye level with him, an unexpectedly human gesture from a woman who generally communicated through verticality. The blocks that were found are called memory suppressions. They don't erase memories so much as lock them away, so that you cannot access them. Do you understand what that means? Harry thought about it. I'm missing things, he said slowly. Things I should know. Yes. 34 things. 34 categories of things, she corrected. Each block can contain multiple, potentially hundreds of, individual memories or pieces of information. The actual scope of what was taken from you we won't know until the blocks are removed. She held his gaze. That will need to happen at St. Mungo's, with certified healers. Tonight, if possible. Harry nodded. He felt very calm, which he suspected wasn't entirely appropriate given the circumstances, but he didn't seem to have access to a more suitable emotional response. The disc was still floating beside his ear, still glowing its steady red, and he had a sudden irrational impulse to take it out of the air and hold it, as if it were something he needed to keep safe. Professor, Hermione said from 2 seats down. She was using the voice she used when she had a question that couldn't wait, which was most of her questions. Why would someone put memory blocks on a child? What would the purpose be? McGonagall straightened up. She looked at Hermione with the expression of a woman who is deciding how much to say in front of a room that contains roughly 400 people. That, she said, is one of the questions the Wisengamot will be asking. She turned back to the staff table, where Dumbledore was still standing, silver bindings at his wrists, watching everything with an expression of patient, sorrowful composure. For a moment they simply looked at each other across the length of the great hall, the headmaster and the deputy headmistress, 2 people who had worked together for decades, standing on opposite sides of a line that had just been drawn. Sit down, Please, everyone, McGonagall said, to the room at large, and the authority in it was such that 400 people immediately did exactly that. The feast will proceed. Prefects, please ensure your first years are settled. She turned to Professor Flitwick. Filius, you are acting deputy headmaster until further notice. Flitwick blinked rapidly. Yes, of course, Minerva. She turned to Snape. The two of them looked at each other for exactly 2 seconds. Something passed between them, a conversation that happened entirely in the space between people who know each other too well for words to be efficient. Severus, she said. I'll stay with him, Snape said. He didn't specify who he meant. He didn't need to. McGonagall nodded once and walked back to Dumbledore. Come, Albus. Dumbledore moved with her toward the doors, unhurried, dignified, and Harry watched him go and still couldn't find the feeling he was apparently supposed to have. He thought about 34 locks. He thought about all the rooms behind those locks and what might be in them. He thought about the fact that he'd had 11 years of his life and apparently some significant portion of it had been tucked away somewhere without his consent or knowledge. He picked up his fork. Ron was staring at him with an expression of absolute bewilderment. Are you eating? I haven't eaten since this morning, Harry said. Ron stared at him for another moment, then picked up his own fork. Fair enough, he said. Because Ron, whatever his faults, had excellent instincts about when to push and when to let things alone. Hermione did not have those instincts. Harry, Dumbledore just got arrested because of something in your head, and you're eating roast chicken. I don't know what else to do, Harry said, which was honest. And McGonagall said the blocks have to come out before anyone knows anything, so there's nothing I can do right now except wait. And eat. Because I am genuinely very hungry. Hermione opened her mouth, thought about this, and reached for the potatoes. That's actually quite rational, she admitted. Surprisingly, Harry agreed. The Aurors arrived 47 minutes later, which Harry knew because he had been watching the clock with the specific attention of someone trying not to think about everything else. He'd eaten a great deal of food by then, almost compensatorily, as if caloric intake could serve as ballast against the sense that the floor had changed quality beneath him without changing appearance. It still looked like a floor. It felt different. There were 3 of them. Senior Aurors, identified by the thickness of the gold trim on their robes and the particular way they moved through the great hall, not aggressively, not theatrically, but with the compact efficiency of people who have done this in more volatile rooms than this one and adjusted their approach accordingly. The lead one was a woman Harry didn't recognize, broad-shouldered and gray-eyed, with close-cropped dark hair and the kind of face that had clearly made its peace with being unreadable. She found McGonagall first, spoke to her briefly in a low voice, then glanced over McGonagall's shoulder at Harry with a look that was accessory rather than invasive. Clinical, but not cold. Then she crossed the room toward him, and the students around Harry did their second spontaneous parting of the sea maneuver of the evening. Harry Potter, the Auror said. Not a question. Yes. I'm Senior Auror Tonks, Margaret Tonks, not to be confused with my niece who is, I'm told, currently in her 3rd year here. A brief pause in which she clearly decided this wasn't the moment for relative humor. I'm leading the initial response to this evening's events. I need to ask you a few questions before we arrange transport to St. Mungo's. Okay, Harry said. Are you experiencing any unusual symptoms? Headaches, visual disturbance, memory gaps, anything that feels different from how you felt this morning? Harry considered this honestly. Everything feels the same, he said. That's the problem, right? I can't feel what's missing because I don't know it's missing. Auror Tonks looked at him with an expression that was professionally neutral but had something else moving underneath it. That's exactly right, she said, and there was a careful weight to the words. Very perceptive. She straightened. Your head of house will accompany you to St. Mungo's. The block removal procedure, I already explained the procedure, McGonagall said, appearing at Harry's elbow with the silent efficiency she seemed to deploy at will. Right. Tonks nodded. Then I think we should move. The healers are ready and it's better to start the removal sooner rather than later. Some blocks can begin to reinforce themselves when they register that the system around them has been disturbed. Harry stood up, and something about the act of standing felt significant in a way he couldn't articulate. He pushed his chair in. He turned to Ron and Hermione, who were both watching him with expressions that were trying very hard to be normal and not quite managing it. "I'll see you when I get back," he said. Hermione nodded. Her jaw was set in the way it set when she was about to cry and had decided that crying was not an appropriate response to circumstances. "We'll be here." Ron reached across the table and thumped him once, solidly, on the shoulder. It was such an unambiguously friendly gesture, so entirely without agenda or performance, that Harry felt something shift slightly in his chest. He hadn't had many of those. He hadn't realized he'd been cataloging their absence. "Don't let them poke your brain too hard," Ron said. "I'll try." He followed McGonagall and the Aurors toward the doors. He passed the point where Dumbledore had stood with the silver bindings at his wrists, and there was nothing there now except the stone floor, the candlelight, and the distant sound of 400 students pretending not to watch him leave. He walked through the doors. The night outside was cold and very clear, the kind of autumn night that felt like a demonstration of how clean air could get if you removed the city from it. The grounds of Hogwarts spread away in every direction, dark lawn, darker water, the forest pressing against the edge of visibility. Harry had been here for perhaps 4 hours and had seen almost none of it. He took a moment, without planning to simply look at the castle behind him, its windows lit, its towers reaching up into a sky so thick with stars that the gaps between them seemed almost incidental. McGonagall was watching him. She did that, he was beginning to notice, watched him with careful attention, like she was waiting to see which way he was going to fall. "How long have you suspected?" Harry asked her. The question landed without preamble and McGonagall received it the same way, without apparent surprise, without deflection. She was quiet for a moment, which he understood was not evasion but honesty, giving the question the weight it deserved. "I didn't suspect this specifically," she said finally. "I knew something wasn't right about your situation. Your home environment." Dumbledore was always very certain about where you should live and very disinclined to allow any assessment of it. "I raised concerns. On 3 occasions. Her voice was level but there was something under the levelness. "Each time, I was told it was necessary." "Did you believe him?" "I wanted to," she said. And the honesty of that, the admission of wanting rather than believing, told him more than a longer answer would have. He has a way of making the choices he's made feel inevitable. As though any other path would have led somewhere worse. "Maybe it would have," Harry said. "Perhaps." She looked at him. "But that's a conversation for after we know what was in those blocks. Not before." One of the Aurors had produced a portkey, a small brass compass that glinted in the starlight. Tonks held it out toward Harry. "Ready?" she said. Harry thought about the 34 circles blazing red. He thought about rooms he'd never been allowed to enter. He thought about 11 years of being himself without knowing who himself actually was. "Yeah," he said. "Let's find out." He touched the compass. The world turned inside out, the castle spun away behind him, and the cold star-thick sky went with it, and for the first time in Harry Potter's life, something was about to be given back. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries occupied a building in London that appeared, to all Muggle passers-by, to be a condemned department store with boards over the windows and a sign explaining that it had been closed for renovation since 1987. The windows had been boarded over for roughly 400 years, making the renovation sign either very optimistic or very lazy, depending on your perspective. Inside, it was nothing like a condemned department store. It was brightly lit, aggressively clean, and filled with the particular energy of a hospital that operates continuously, the sense of organized urgency that permeates every hallway, every interaction, every face that passes you in a corridor. At 9:30 at night, the intake ward was quiet but not empty, A handful of healers in lime green robes moving through it with the purposeful efficiency of people who had shifted into that gear so long ago they'd forgotten it wasn't their natural speed. The healer who came to meet them was small and precisely put together, with short black hair and rectangular glasses and the kind of contained energy that suggested she was running approximately 4 more trains of thought than she was currently expressing. Her name, she told Harry, was Healer Voss. She spoke to him like he was a person rather than a patient, which Harry appreciated more than he could have explained. The procedure takes as long as it takes, she said, leading them down a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and something faintly herbal. Some blocks come away cleanly, those are the shallow ones, more recent installations, placed on top of existing structure. Others are deeply integrated with your natural neural architecture, which means the removal needs to be careful rather than fast. She glanced at him over her shoulder. It's not painful. I want to be clear about that. It may be disorienting, and when memories return there can be an emotional intensity. Imagine a room that's been sealed and dark for years suddenly getting light. The contents haven't changed, but seeing them clearly all at once can be overwhelming. What if some of the memories are bad? Harry asked. Voss didn't flinch from the question. Some of them probably will be. We'll have a mind healer present throughout. You're not going through this alone. McGonagall, walking behind them, said nothing. But Harry heard her exhale, slow and deliberate, and decided not to look back at her. The room they brought him to was smaller than he expected, not the clinical enormity of a surgical theater, just a room with a reclining chair, a low table bearing a collection of instruments that shared certain visual qualities with the bronze disc from the Great Hall, and a window that looked out onto a London skyline that didn't know it was adjacent to magic. There was a second healer already present, older, round-faced, with the particular patient stillness of someone trained specifically in the landscape of other people's minds. This is Healer Marsden, Voss said. He'll be monitoring your emotional state throughout and can slow or pause the process if you need a moment. Marsden nodded at Harry in a way that managed to be both professional and kind without effort. You're going to be all right, he said, and it wasn't reassurance in the empty sense. He said it the way you state a fact you've confirmed multiple times. Harry sat in the chair. McGonagall had stopped in the doorway. I'll be just outside, she said. You can stay, Harry said. She looked at him, and something passed across her expression that she didn't try to conceal. Are you sure? Yeah. He looked at the instruments on the table, the soft light of the room, the window and its ordinary London skyline. Yeah. Stay. She crossed the room and took the chair against the wall. She sat in it with the upright precision she brought to everything, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she stayed. Voss began the first removal. It was nothing like pain. It was more like pressure releasing. As if something that had been pressing very slightly against a specific part of his awareness from the inside suddenly wasn't there anymore. And then it was like a door opening. He was 7 years old, and he was doing something with his hands that he knew was wrong by the Dursley standards but that felt necessary, the way water needs to run downhill. He was 7 years old and he could feel something thrumming in his palms, something that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite electricity and wanted to go somewhere. He'd pushed it down without knowing why he was pushing it down, just that some instinct said not here, not now, not ever, but the memory underneath that instinct was there now and he could feel what the magic had felt like before the pushing started. Before the blocking. He'd been 7 and his magic had wanted to sing. The second block came down, and he was 8, and he was reading a book that wasn't supposed to exist. He'd found it in the school library, a thin paperback shelved incorrectly between 2 geography texts, and it was about, he could almost, the third block, and the reading came back with it, and he understood what the book had been. A child's primer on elemental theory, basic magical principles, written for Muggle-born children whose parents had been informed early. He'd read it cover to cover in one sitting and understood every word of it with the ease of someone reading about things they already know on a level below language. The librarian had come to collect it before he could take it out, and afterward he'd forgotten it existed, but that wasn't forgetting. That was a door being locked. Easy, Marsden said quietly. Breathe. Harry breathed. The room was still there, the instruments, the window, McGonagall in the chair against the wall watching him with eyes that were doing the careful, controlled thing they did when she was managing something significant. The blocks kept coming down. He was 9, and someone at school had called him a freak, and the word had landed the way it always did, deep and settling, like it was filling a shape that was already carved for it. But underneath that memory was another one, an older one that the block had been placed over, the knowledge that freak was a word people used when they were afraid, and that being afraid of someone was not the same as being right about them. He'd known that once. He'd known it with the certainty of a child who hasn't yet been taught to doubt themselves. The block had gone in and the certainty had gone with it, and he'd spent 2 years accepting the word as a description instead of a symptom. Take your time, Voss said. She was watching the instruments with focused attention, making small adjustments with her wand. You're doing well. He was 10, and he could feel the shape of his own magic for the first time, not the accidental manifestations, the glass tank and the vanishing incidents, those were symptoms of pressure finding cracks. This was the actual structure of it. It was vast. Even at 10, running partial and blocked and constrained by 11 layers of suppression, it was vast, and he understood now why he'd never felt entirely contained in his own body. He'd been trying to live in a house with the walls pushed in. Block after block after block. Some of them hurt in the way Voss had warned, not physical pain but the particular sharp intensity of seeing something you'd lost, finally recovered, and the mixed quality of the recovery. He was 6 years old and crying in the cupboard under the stairs, and he knew, at 6, that this was wrong. He'd known with absolute clarity that this was wrong and someone should stop it, and the block had gone in and the knowledge had gone with it, and he'd stopped crying and started adapting, which was what Dumbledore had needed him to do. Which was, Harry understood now, the point. Okay, Marsden said. Just, let yourself feel it. Don't push past it. Harry let himself feel it. He didn't cry. He wasn't sure why. The material was certainly sufficient for crying. But what he felt instead was something harder and clearer, a quality of understanding that didn't require tears because it was something other than grief. It was closer to recognition. The closing of a distance he hadn't known existed between more actions. Request aborted. Write the next chapter now. Chapter 2, 34 rooms. The last block came down at 2:47 in the morning. Harry knew the exact time because there was a clock on the wall above the window, and he'd been watching it with the part of his attention that wasn't occupied by the returning flood of everything he'd been missing for 11 years. Voss had slowed the process twice, once when his heart rate spiked during the removal of a cluster of blocks around age 8, and once when block 29 came away and he'd had to spend 15 minutes simply sitting with what it contained before he could continue. Marsden had not rushed him. Neither had McGonagall, who had not moved from her chair against the wall the entire time, who had watched everything with the steadiness of someone who had decided to be a fixed point in the room and was committed to that. The last one was the deepest. Voss had warned him it would be. She'd said the earliest blocks were the most integrated, the most carefully layered into his existing neural architecture, the ones that Dumbledore had installed when Harry was barely more than a year old. 1 year old. Harry had absorbed this information when Voss told him and filed it somewhere that he wasn't ready to open yet. The last block came down and the room went very quiet. Harry sat in a chair and breathed, and the clock on the wall said 2:47, and through the window London was doing what London does at 2:47, glittering indifferently, full of its own concerns, entirely unbothered by the fact that a boy in a hospital room had just had himself handed back to himself in pieces. He was aware of several things simultaneously. The first was that his magic felt completely different. Not stronger in the way that a muscle feels stronger after exercise, different in the way that a landscape looks different after a fog lifts. It had always been there. He'd always had it. But the shape of it had been distorted by 11 years of containment, compressed and rerouted around the blocks the way a river reroutes around dams, and now the dams were gone. He could feel it settling into its actual dimensions, spreading slowly into spaces it had never been allowed to occupy, and the feeling was so extraordinary that he didn't have a word for it. Relief came close. So did terrifying. The second was that he was absolutely furious. Not the hot, reactive fury that erupts from surprise or immediate injury. Something colder and more structural, the kind of anger that forms when you finally understand the full dimensions of something that was done to you, and the understanding is so complete that there's no room for confusion to soften it. He knew now exactly what had been taken, when it had been taken, and why. He had 34 rooms of reasons to be furious, and every one of them was clearly lit. The third thing was that Minerva McGonagall was watching him from across the room and her eyes were red. Not wet. She hadn't cried. But her eyes were red, and the set of her jaw was the set of a woman who had been managing an enormous thing for several hours and was still managing it, and the sight of it, the evidence of her committed, witness distress, did something unexpected to the inside of Harry's chest. "It's done?" he asked Voss. "All 34, Voss confirmed." She was reviewing the instruments with methodical attention, cross-checking readings against a parchment that had accumulated considerable notation. "There's no residual blockage. Your memory architecture is intact, that was the primary concern, that the removal might cause lacunae in areas adjacent to the blocks, but the integrity looks good." She looked up from the instruments and at him directly. "How do you feel?" Harry considered this honestly. "Like myself," he said. "For the first time, I think. Like properly myself." Something moved across Voss's professional composure and was suppressed. "Good," she said. "That's what it should feel like." McGonagall stood up. She crossed the room in 5 steps and stood in front of him, looking down at him in the chair, and her eyes were still red at the edges, and she said nothing for a moment, just looked at him with that careful, inventory-taking attention. Then she said, "I owe you an apology, Mr. Potter." Harry blinked. "You just had Dumbledore arrested for me. I should have done something sooner." Her voice was precise and unsparing, directed at herself rather than at him. "I had concerns about your placement, about several things Dumbledore had done in relation to you, and I raised them through appropriate channels and then, accepted the answers I was given. Because it was easier than not accepting them. Because Albus has always been very good at making capitulation feel like wisdom." Her jaw tightened. "That ends tonight." Harry looked at her for a long moment. "I don't blame you," he said, and meant it. "Not yet. I'm still sorting through what I know. But I don't blame you." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "That's very gracious of you. It doesn't change what I should have done." Marsden, who had been quietly completing his own documentation, looked up. "Mr. Potter, I'd like to do a brief assessment, check that the emotional integration is progressing normally. It's standard after a procedure like this." He paused. "I also want to say, professionally, that what you've managed tonight, the processing, the stability, the way you've engaged with each recovery, is remarkable. Most adults would need considerably more time." "I've had practice," Harry said, not feeling things until later. Marsden wrote something down and nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. "I imagine you have." The assessment took 20 minutes. It was largely conversational, Marsden asking questions in a calm, unhurried tone that managed to be neither intrusive nor dismissive, and Harry answering them honestly because he couldn't see the benefit of doing otherwise. At the end of it, Marsden confirmed that the integration was proceeding normally, that there were no signs of dissociation or acute distress that would require intervention, and that Harry should expect the memories to continue settling and cross-referencing over the next several days, occasionally with the sudden intensity of something newly connected. "Like dreaming while awake," Harry said. "That's very accurate," Marsden said. While this was happening, Auror Tonks had reappeared in the doorway with a parchment for McGonagall, which McGonagall read with a stillness that told Harry nothing but told him something was happening. When Marsden finished, Tonks crossed the room. "We have a situation," she told McGonagall. "Dumbledore's been moved to Ministry Holding, but his solicitors arrived within the hour. Fast, even for preparedness, suggests prior arrangements. He's been expecting something like this for some time, McGonagall said. Not surprised. Not even particularly grim. Just noting it. Possibly. He's been processed and held, which is what matters tonight. The Wisingamot will schedule a preliminary hearing, given the nature of the charges, that should be within the week. Tonks looked at Harry. The detection charm's findings are ironclad evidence. Magical signatures are forensically unique. The probability of a false read on 34 separate blocks all bearing the same signature is essentially zero. But the prosecution will need to establish intent, which means why, Harry said. Tonks nodded. Why 34, why a child, why those specific memories? The more clearly we can answer why, the stronger the case. I can answer why, Harry said. Both women looked at him. He hadn't planned to say it. But the knowing was there, fully formed, sitting in the newly opened rooms with a clarity that made articulating it easy. I can feel magic differently now. The way it actually works, theoretically, structurally. I could always feel it, but after the blocks I couldn't understand what I was feeling. Couldn't use it deliberately. Couldn't control it. He paused. Dumbledore needed me controllable. A boy who understands his own power and knows how to use it doesn't walk into situations he's been designed to walk into. A boy who doesn't know what he can do, who thinks his only value is surviving and following, does. The room was very quiet. I was supposed to be a weapon, Harry said. But weapons don't aim themselves. So he made sure I couldn't. Tonks had the expression of a woman writing notes on parchment she doesn't have in front of her. McGonagall looked like she'd been struck somewhere that wouldn't bruise visibly. You should sleep, McGonagall said, when the silence had gone on long enough. You've processed an enormous amount tonight. There will be more time for this conversation, and it will benefit from you being rested. I'm not tired, Harry said. Which was almost true. He was tired in his body, but his mind had the hyperactive clarity of something newly freed, running circuits it had never been allowed to run, making connections that crackled with the speed of long-delayed recognition. Nevertheless, McGonagall said, in a tone that closed the topic without requiring further input. Harry almost smiled. He was beginning to understand what Ron must have meant when he'd said the Sorting Hat could have put Harry in Slytherin, because his first instinct, looking at McGonagall's tone, was not to comply but to calculate whether there was a productive angle of approach. He filed that away as something to think about later. Can I ask one thing first? One, McGonagall said. The books, Harry said. The things I know now, the magical theory, the techniques I had access to before the blocks, how much of it is real? How much can I actually do? McGonagall and Voss exchanged a look across the room. It was a brief look, the kind that happens between professionals who have just independently arrived at the same conclusion and are verifying that they've arrived there together. We won't know the full extent until you test it, Voss said carefully. But the structural capacity is real. The knowledge is real. The memory isn't the ability, but the memory is what allows you to access the ability correctly. She paused. What I can tell you, based on what the instruments have been showing me for the last 5 hours, is that your magical core is significant. I've been doing this for 19 years and I have not seen a reading like yours outside of advanced diagnostic contexts. What does significant mean exactly? Harry asked. It means, Voss said, choosing her words with the precision of someone stepping carefully, that Dumbledore had very good reasons for being cautious about what you could do. Harry absorbed this. The fury in his chest, cold and structural, settled another fraction deeper. Right, he said. Good to know. McGonagall showed him to a room, a private room, nothing elaborate, hospital clean with a narrow bed and a window that looked out on the same indifferent London, and told him she would be just down the corridor if he needed anything. She said it in the same tone she used for everything, professionally, clearly, with no excessive warmth and no artificial distance. He was beginning to read it now, that tone. It wasn't coldness. It was the inverse. it was a way of talking to someone that treated them as a person capable of managing information, rather than someone who needed it softened or withheld. He respected that enormously. He lay down on the narrow bed, and he didn't sleep. He lay in the dark with his eyes open and let the memories move. That's what it felt like, movement, rather than the explosive flooding he'd half expected. They settled in gradually, cross-referencing with what he knew, with 11 years of experience that had been lived through the distorting lens of the blocks. He began reinterpreting things. The scar on his forehead, which he'd been told was the simple residue of a curse, he knew more about that now. The connection it maintained. He knew more about Voldemort, about the night of the killing curse, about what the curse meeting Lily Potter's sacrificial magic had done to Harry's own magical core in the process of redirecting it. He knew what Dumbledore had found when he tested Harry 3 days after the attack. He knew why the blocks had started at 1 year old. He stared at the ceiling of the hospital room and the fury was still there and he let it stay there, because the alternative, letting it distort into something less clear, would be letting it do what Dumbledore had spent 11 years doing to other things. Distorting them for a purpose. Harry did not intend to be distorted for any purpose, by anyone, ever again. He fell asleep around 4. He didn't dream. He woke up to Hermione Granger sitting in the chair beside his bed with a book open on her lap, reading with the focused intensity of someone who has been reading for some time. Harry stared at her. "How did you get here?" "McGonagall brought us this morning," Hermione said, not looking up from the book. She flooded Ron's mum and explained the situation, and Mrs. Weasley agreed that under the circumstances it was reasonable, and they were kind enough to let us come. She turned a page. "Ron is in the corridor eating something. He found a vending machine and is deeply confused by it, but in a committed sort of way." As if on cue, Ron's voice came from behind the door, "Why doesn't it work if you put the coin in sideways?" "That's a Muggle thing," Hermione called back. "I know it's a Muggle thing, I want to understand the Muggle thing, the slot is designed for a specific coin orientation, Ron, it's not complicated, everything about this is complicated." Harry started laughing. It came out of nowhere, catching him entirely off guard, a full, genuine laugh, the kind that belongs to a specific category of amusement that sits at the intersection of exhaustion, relief, and the specific absurdity of finding, at the worst possible moment, that you like the people around you. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that. He wasn't sure he'd ever laughed like that. Hermione finally looked up from her book, and she was smiling, and the smile was doing that thing where it was trying not to be too big because the situation was serious, but it was losing. "How are you?" she asked. Harry sat up. He ran a hand through his hair, which was doing its usual architectural disaster. "Different," he said. "Better. Angrier." He paused. "More myself." Hermione looked at him carefully, the way she looked at problems she was actively solving. "McGonagall told us the basics. 34 blocks, all Dumbledore's signature, since you were a baby." She closed the book. "I've been in the hospital library since 6 this morning." Of course she had. "What did you find?" "Quite a lot." She opened the book again and Harry realized it wasn't the novel he'd assumed, it was a dense legal text, its pages marked with multiple strips of folded parchment. Memory suppression in magical children is covered under the Magical Child Welfare Act of 1953 and its 1978 amendment. The 1978 amendment specifically addresses cognitive suppression by a recognized authority figure, which Dumbledore is, in approximately 9 different official capacities, and classifies it as aggravated magical interference. That's the highest classification under child welfare law. She looked up. Hermione Granger, student at large, does not have access to most of the ministry's legal database. However, I do have access to this book, which is a commentary on the Act, and I have also been talking to Auror Tonks since 7 this morning, who is extremely forthcoming for a law enforcement officer. You've been awake since 6. Harry said. I've been awake since about 2, she admitted. I couldn't sleep. The door opened and Ron came in carrying a packet of crisps with the satisfaction of a man who has conquered something. He looked at Harry and stopped. "Oh, good, you're awake." He looked at the crisps, looked at Harry, and held the packet out. "Want some?" "I figured out the machine." "How?" Harry and Hermione said simultaneously. "I put the coin in flat and kicked the side." He shook the crisps. "Do you want them or not?" Harry took a crisp. "How long have you been here?" "Since 8. Ron settled into the second chair with the relaxed ease of someone who had decided the situation was manageable. "My mum wanted to come herself but McGonagall said it was better to keep things quiet for now. She did send enough food for approximately 6 people, which is just in the bag by the door." He jerked his head toward the door, where a large canvas bag that Harry had somehow missed was sitting against the wall. "Also she sent a note. Here." He held out a folded piece of parchment and Harry took it. The handwriting was large and rounded with an energy that came off the page even in the written word. "Dear Harry, Fred and George say you're famous and therefore probably fine, but I am a mother and don't set much store by that kind of reasoning, so I want you to know you are welcome at the Burrow any time, including immediately and for as long as you like, and I am extremely angry on your behalf and am directing that anger at the appropriate target. There is chicken in the bag. Molly Weasley." Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and held it for a moment, aware of a quality of warmth in his chest that was new, or rather, that he was newly able to recognize as something he'd been missing. "She's like that," Ron said, observing him. "You get used to it." "I hope I don't," Harry said. Ron grinned. "Yeah. Me neither, actually." McGonagall arrived at 9 with Auror Tonks and a healer he hadn't met before, who needed to do a follow-up assessment and sign off on Harry's physical and magical status for the Ministry's records. The assessment was brief. The healer confirmed the same thing Voss had said the previous night, that Harry's magical core readings were extraordinary, and added the marginally alarming detail that the readings had risen approximately 18% since the block removal, suggesting that the core was still in the process of expanding into its unblocked dimensions. She noted this in the same brisk professional tone she'd used to record an unremarkable blood pressure and moved on, and Harry filed the information alongside Voss's comments from the night before and thought, so this is what Dumbledore was afraid of. After the healer left, McGonagall sat down and looked at the three of them, Harry, Ron, Hermione, with the expression of a woman about to have a conversation that matters. "The preliminary hearing has been scheduled," she said. "Thursday. 4 days from now. The Wisengamot will review the evidence and determine whether to proceed to a full trial." She paused. "I want to be honest with you about what that process will look like. Dumbledore has considerable support within the Ministry and the wizarding community at large. There will be people who argue for context, for nuance, for an understanding of his motivations that softens the charges. Some of them will be people in positions of considerable influence." Her eyes didn't leave Harry. "I want you to be prepared for that." "You mean people will defend him," Harry said. "Some will defend him sincerely, because they believe his motives were good. Some will defend him strategically, because they depend on the power structures he represents." She folded her hands. "Neither of those things changes what the detection charm found. The evidence is forensic. It doesn't require your testimony to stand." "However," she stopped. "However, my testimony would strengthen it," Harry said. "Yes. Then I'll testify. No hesitation. No deliberation. Just the fact of it, clean and clear." McGonagall looked at him and there it was again, that quality of careful, taking inventory attention, but underneath it now was something else. Something that might, in less controlled circumstances, have looked like pride. "You're 11 years old," she said. "I know how old I am," Harry said. "That's not a reason." "It's not," she agreed. "It's an observation." She was quiet for a moment. "There's something else. Something I need to discuss with you before you hear it from another source." She looked at Tonks briefly, and Tonks gave a small nod. The detection charms report was transmitted to the Department of Magical Child Welfare, as I said. Standard procedure. However, the department is part of the ministry, and the ministry, particularly the office of the minister, Cornelius Fudge, has interests that don't always align cleanly with the interests of the law. Hermione leaned forward. Are they trying to suppress the report? They are trying to contextualize it, McGonagall said, with a precision that made contextualize sound like a synonym for something considerably less polite. There are elements within the ministry who are concerned that proceeding aggressively against Dumbledore will destabilize what they see as necessary protective structures, particularly given the climate following you-know-who's disappearance. His name was Voldemort, Harry said. The room went briefly still. Tonks blinked. McGonagall absorbed it without flinching. Yes, she said. It was. I'm not going to be afraid of his name, Harry said. It wasn't bravado, it came out matter of fact, an item of settled personal policy rather than a performance. People act like saying it summons something. It's just a name. He paused. And if we're talking about Dumbledore suppressing things for political reasons, we probably shouldn't be afraid of words. Ron was looking at him with an expression that was trying to contain something between admiration and uncertainty. Hermione was looking at him with pure focus, the way she looked at problems that were developing interestingly. McGonagall said, I agree entirely. So what do we do about the ministry? Harry asked. That, Tonks said, speaking up for the first time, is where Amelia Bones comes in. Who's Amelia Bones? Ron said. Head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Tonks said. Which means she outranks the Child Welfare Department, sits directly below the minister in the hierarchy, and has approximately zero patience for political interference in legal proceedings. She reviewed the detection charm report at 6 this morning and has already sent a memo to the minister's office. Tonks allowed herself a small smile. I've worked for her for 3 years. When Amelia Bones sends a memo, people tend to behave. I want to meet her, Harry said. Tonks looked at him with what he was beginning to recognize as genuine assessment rather than the starstruck evaluation he'd been getting since arriving at King's Cross the previous day. She was looking at who he actually was, and apparently finding it coherent with something she'd expected or hoped for. She wants to meet you too, Tonks said. This afternoon, if you're up for it. I'm up for it, Harry said. Then I'll arrange it. She stood. Before that, though, you should eat something, and then I'd suggest a walk, both for your own sake and because there are things you can learn about yourself in open space that you can't learn in a hospital room. She paused. Your magic is still settling. Fresh air will help. Harry looked at the window and the ordinary London morning beyond it. Then he looked at Ron and Hermione. Breakfast first, Ron said immediately. Of course you'd say that, Hermione said. I'm also saying it, Harry said. They found a cafe 2 streets away from the department store facade. It was an ordinary Muggle cafe, slightly too warm, with steamed-up windows and a chalkboard menu, and they sat in a booth in the back and Harry ordered the largest breakfast on the menu without looking at the price, which was a first. He was dimly aware, from the newly accessible memories, that there was a vault at Gringotts in his name that he'd never been told about, one of approximately 9 pieces of information Dumbledore had seen fit to block rather than share with an orphan child who might have found comfort in knowing he wasn't entirely destitute. He'd think about the full scope of that particular category later. For now, eggs, toast, bacon, a mug of tea that was too hot to drink and therefore perfect. Tell us, Hermione said. She didn't specify what. She didn't need to. Harry wrapped his hands around the mug and thought about where to start. The trouble was the scope. 34 categories wasn't a straightforward story, it was a library, and walking someone through a library required deciding which shelf to start from. The magic is the main thing, he said finally. That's what was most suppressed and most extensively blocked. Not just skills or techniques, the fundamental understanding of what my magic is and how it works. He paused. It's like, Imagine you're naturally good at mathematics. Not just school good, genuinely intuitive, the kind of thing where numbers make sense to you the way a language makes sense to someone who grew up speaking it. And then someone goes in and blocks that intuition, so you still have to do the maths but you have to do it the slow way, by rote, without the understanding underneath it. And you don't know the intuition was ever there because you can't remember before the block. Hermione was listening with her full attention. And now? Now it's back, Harry said. All of it. And it's not just stronger. It's mine in a way it didn't used to be. He turned the mug in his hands. The second major thing was information. Things Dumbledore decided I shouldn't know. My parents, what they were like, what they could do. The vault. The magical community, how it actually works, the political structure. The prophecy. He stopped. Ron looked up from his eggs. Prophecy? There's a prophecy, Harry said. About me and Voldemort. He'd decided last night, in the dark of the hospital room, that this was something he would tell them, and he'd decided it because the alternative, keeping information from people who were choosing to be here, felt uncomfortably like what Dumbledore had done. Dumbledore knows about it. It's one of the main reasons for the blocks. He needed me to not know what I was capable of until the specific moment he decided I needed to be capable of it. The table was quiet. What does it say? Hermione asked. The prophecy. It says one of us has to kill the other, Harry said. Or something close enough to that. I don't know the exact wording, Dumbledore heard it, not me, and that specific memory I don't have access to. But the shape of it is clear from the context in the other blocks. He took a sip of tea. It was still slightly too hot. Dumbledore's plan, as far as I can work it out, was to keep me just capable enough to survive Hogwarts, keep me ignorant enough to be managed, and eventually position me for a confrontation with Voldemort at a time and in a way that he controlled. He set the mug down. The problem with that plan is that it required me to either die or win while being significantly less powerful than I actually am. Ron and Hermione stared at him. He was going to let you die. Ron said. He was going to let it be a possibility he accepted, Harry said. Which isn't quite the same thing, in his head, I think. He'd have told himself it was a sacrifice in service of something necessary. The greater good. He said the last two words with a flatness that gave them their full weight. He really believes it. That's the part that takes the most processing. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring at the table. When she looked up, her eyes were sharp and her jaw had the set he was already beginning to recognize as her particular brand of resolved fury. He's wrong, she said simply. Yes, Harry said. About all of it. Not just the methods. The entire premise, that one person gets to make those decisions for everyone else without their knowledge or consent, because he's decided he knows best. She was building momentum now, the way she built it in class when she hit a concept that made something click. He's treating people as instruments. As pieces to be moved. And calling it love or protection or necessity doesn't change what it is. I know, Harry said. We should probably eat, Ron said, which was his version of agreeing completely. After breakfast they walked. The morning was grey and mild, the streets busy with ordinary London purpose, and Harry walked in the middle of the pavement with his hands in his pockets and felt things happening in him that he didn't try to stop or manage. His magic was settling, the way Tonks had said it would, and in open air it felt less like pressure and more like weather, present around him, responsive to him, part of the environment in a way that felt natural rather than contained. He tried something small. He didn't announce it and he didn't make it visible, he simply held out his hand, slightly behind his back, and thought about a leaf from the plane tree they were passing under, and it came off the branch and into his palm as cleanly as if it had fallen there. He'd meant to bring a leaf. What came instead was 6 of them, from 6 different branches, stacked neatly in his hand like a small collected deck of cards. He looked at them for a moment. Put them in his pocket. You're doing something, Hermione said, without looking at him. "Just checking something," Harry said. "What?" "Whether the range is accurate," he said. The tree they'd been under was now a full block behind them. All 6 leaves had come from branches at the crown. "It's more than I thought." Hermione looked at him sideways. She looked at where the tree was. She looked at his pocket. "Harry," she said, with the focused attention of someone running a calculation. "I've been reading about magical core theory since this morning." "I know. The readings Healer Voss mentioned. Significant. Do you know what that means specifically, in terms of the classification system?" "What does it mean specifically?" Harry asked. "Merlin class is the highest designation. It hasn't been applied to a living wizard in recorded history." She kept walking. "I'm not saying that's what you are. I'm saying the threshold for significant in the context she used it begins at the classification below that, and that based on what I read, what she described, the core expansion, the 18% rise still ongoing, would be consistent with someone in the upper range of that category." Harry said nothing. The morning moved around him. A bus went past, red and oblivious. A dog pulled at its lead and barked at a pigeon, and the pigeon rose and settled elsewhere, and the dog was satisfied. "I'm not afraid of it," Harry said. "I know you're not," Hermione said. "Good." He looked forward, along the grey London street, at the hospital facade visible at the end of the block. "Because I'm not going to hide it or suppress it or keep it small so someone else feels comfortable." He paused. 11 years of that is enough. Hermione nodded once. "Sharp and absolute." "Agreed." Ron had been listening to all of this with the quiet attention he deployed when something genuinely mattered, which was different from his default mode of easy good humor but not incompatible with it. He fell into step on Harry's other side, and for a moment the 3 of them walked together in the grey London morning without speaking, and the quality of the not speaking was something that Harry understood was rare. The kind of silence that doesn't require filling because the people in it have already said what matters. "So what do we do now?" Ron said. "Meeting with Amelia Bones this afternoon," Harry said. And then, he thought about the preliminary hearing 4 days away. He thought about Dumbledore in Ministry holding, patient and composed. He thought about 34 rooms, now all open, all lit. "And then we make sure they can't make this small," he said. "No matter what they try." "Right," said Ron. "Obviously," said Hermione. They walked back into the hospital, and the morning kept going around them, and Harry Potter, fully himself for the first time in his life, began to think about what came next. Amelia Bones arrived at 2 in the afternoon with 2 aides and the brisk, no-ceremony energy of a woman who had removed inefficiency from her personal presentation sometime in her 30s and had not missed it since. She was broad-shouldered and gray-haired, with a monocle that she wore with the comfortable authority of someone who had long since made their peace with being distinctive, and she assessed Harry in the first 3 seconds with the precise eye of a woman who had spent 30 years evaluating witnesses. She sat down across from him at the table in the hospital's meeting room, set a folder on the table between them, and said, without preamble, "The detection charm report is unambiguous. 34 blocks, all bearing Dumbledore's forensic magical signature, installed over a period of approximately 10 years beginning when you were approximately 14 months old. The earliest installations are the deepest, suggesting that the initial blocking was the most deliberate and the subsequent additions were maintenance rather than expansion." She opened the folder. "Healer Voss's post-removal assessment has been filed with my office. I want you to know that I have read it in full." "The core readings," Harry said. Bones looked up from the folder and at him directly. "The core readings," she confirmed. "Among other things." She closed the folder. "I'm going to speak to you like an adult, Mr. Potter, because the evidence suggests you're capable of handling it and because I find condescension counterproductive." "Good," Harry said. "Dumbledore is not simply a man who committed a crime. He is the center of a network of influence that permeates magical Britain's institutions, the Hogwarts Board of Governors, the Wisengamot, several departments of the ministry, and a number of private individuals who owe him varying degrees of loyalty. His trial will not simply be a legal proceeding. It will be a political event, and the forces arrayed against accountability are significant. She held his gaze without flinching. That said, the evidence is forensic. His signature is on every block. That cannot be argued away, only contextualized. He'll argue necessity, Harry said. The prophecy, the war, the greater good. Bones raised an eyebrow by approximately 3 millimeters. You know about the prophecy. I know about a lot of things now, Harry said. That's what happens when you remove the blocks. Bones was quiet for a moment. The prophecy is sealed at the Department of Mysteries, she said. Officially, it doesn't exist outside a very small circle. The fact that you know about it, from your own recovered memories, is significant for the case. She leaned forward slightly. It establishes motive. Not just a vague sense of greater good, but a specific, documented reason for the suppression. He wasn't managing a powerful child out of general caution. He was managing you toward a specific outcome. That's premeditated. Yes, Harry said. Will you testify to this? Yes. Bones looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way of someone filing a decision away. Good. I have one other question, and I want you to think before you answer rather than giving me the reflexive response. Okay. Are you aware of the scope of your magical capacity now that the blocks are removed? Have you tested it? Harry thought about 6 leaves from 6 branches, a full block away. He thought about the way it had felt, not effortful, not even particularly deliberate. He thought about the hospital room the night before and the feeling of his magic spreading, still expanding. I'm aware of some of it, he said honestly. I haven't tested the full scope. I don't think I could yet, it's still settling. He paused. But it's significant. Voss said significant. Voss is understating it, Bones said flatly. As is Healer Prentice, who signed off on your assessment this morning. They're both being cautious because they're medical professionals and caution is appropriate in their field. She looked at him steadily. I'm a law enforcement professional, and in my field, accurate information is more useful than caution. She paused. You are the most powerfully gifted magical individual to have been assessed in living memory. Possibly longer. Do you understand what that means for how people will respond to you? Harry thought about it. Some people will be afraid, he said. Some people will want to use it. And some people, Bones said, will try to put the blocks back. The room was very quiet. I'd like to see them try, Harry said. And Amelia Bones, who had been a law enforcement professional for 30 years and had learned not to make expressions that gave away assessments, allowed herself a very small smile. Yes, she said. I imagine you would. Chapter 3, The Weight of What Was Taken. The owls started arriving on Wednesday. Harry was in the Hogwarts library. McGonagall had brought him and Ron and Hermione back to the castle on Monday morning, citing the practical reality that 4 days at St. Mungo's was not a sustainable arrangement and that Hogwarts, despite recent events, remained the safest location in Britain for a student whose situation had become as publicly complicated as Harry's. When the first one came in through a window that wasn't technically supposed to be open, dropped a letter directly on the page he was reading, and left without waiting for a response. The letter was from a man named Lucius Malfoy, and it was written in the careful, crafted prose of someone who had spent decades communicating in a language where every word carried a second meaning beneath the first. It expressed deep concern for Harry's well-being. It referenced Dumbledore's long history of service to the wizarding community with the reverence of a man setting up a shield. It suggested, in language so oblique it had to be intentional, that Harry might benefit from wise counsel before making decisions that could affect not only himself but the stability of the broader magical world. Harry read it once, folded it, and put it in the folder McGonagall had given him for exactly this purpose. That's the third one today, Hermione said, not looking up from the stack of legal texts she'd been working through since 6 that morning. Fourth, Harry said. There was one before breakfast that I didn't tell you about. She looked up. Harry. It was fine. I wasn't going to be swayed by a letter from someone named Cornelius Fudge who writes in the third person. Ron, who was lying on the floor between two shelves in a way that Madame Pants had not yet discovered and would object to strenuously when she did, said, Fudge wrote to you. What did he say? That he was looking forward to meeting me at the preliminary hearing and hoped we could discuss the situation in a spirit of mutual understanding. Harry paused. He also mentioned that Dumbledore had been an invaluable resource to the Ministry for 40 years and that the wizarding community valued stability. He said stability. Hermione said. Twice. She made a noise that expressed her opinion of that concisely and went back to her book. The owls were, in some ways, the least interesting development of the past 2 days. Considerably more interesting was what Harry had discovered he could do. It had started on Monday afternoon, back in the castle, when he'd walked into Charm's class and Professor Flitwick had announced, with the slightly elevated energy of a man navigating an unprecedented situation, that the first years would be attempting the Wingardium Leviosa charm, and that they should feel no pressure whatsoever, as it was early days, and most students took several attempts before achieving the correct combination of motion and pronunciation. Harry had looked at the feather on his desk and thought about what he actually knew now, the precise mechanics of the levitation charm, the magical theory underlying it, the way the incantation functioned as a focusing mechanism rather than a cause, and he'd raised his wand and the feather had risen to the ceiling and stayed there, motionless and perfect, and then he'd moved it sideways 20 feet without touching his wand twice. The silence in the classroom had been very loud. Flitwick had recovered with the grace of a small man accustomed to adjusting rapidly. Excellent, he'd said, in the high clear voice that managed to be both surprised and unsurprised simultaneously. Very, yes. Perhaps try something more challenging. He'd glanced around, located the heaviest available object, a large brass bookend on his desk, and indicated it with a gesture. Harry had moved the bookend from the desk to the window ledge and back without standing up. Flitwick had made a small, involuntary sound, written something in his notebook, and moved on. The Transfiguration class on Tuesday had produced a similar dynamic, though McGonagall managed it with characteristic efficiency. She'd watched Harry transfigure a match into a needle with the clean perfection of someone performing a demonstration rather than an exercise, and had then set him a series of progressively complex tasks while teaching the rest of the class, checking his progress every few minutes with the focused attention of someone running a parallel assessment. By the end of class he transfigured a quill into a working compass, then back into a quill, and then, because she'd said try something structural, he transfigured the compass into a small working clock, hands moving, accurate to the minute. McGonagall had looked at the clock for a long moment. Then she'd picked it up, examined it, set it down. Partial to full transfiguration of a mechanical object, she'd said quietly, making a note. First day of term. Is that unusual? Harry had asked. Mr. Potter, she'd said, that is a third-year examination task. After class she'd come to find him in the corridor and told him, with the directness he'd come to rely on, that she wanted to understand the full scope of what he could do before the hearing, not for evidentiary purposes but because she was his teacher and that was her job. She'd also told him, and this was the part that had stayed with him, that she was sorry she hadn't done this before. That she should have looked more carefully, earlier. You couldn't have known about the blocks, Harry had said. I should have questioned what I was being told, she'd replied. There's a difference. He'd thought about that a lot. Wednesday afternoon, the library, 48 hours before the preliminary hearing, Harry closed the book he'd been reading, a dense theoretical text on advanced spell construction that he'd found on the restricted shelf and that Madame Pants had not actually stopped him taking, possibly because of the current climate or possibly because he'd smiled at her and she'd momentarily forgotten to be herself, and looked at the table in front of him. He had a list. Not a formal list, not something written down, a mental inventory that he'd been constructing since Monday, cataloging what he knew now against what he'd known before, identifying the gaps and what filled them. 34 categories meant 34 columns, and each column was deep, and he'd been moving through them systematically in the hours between classes and sleeping and eating and talking to Ron and Hermione, because the alternative, ignoring them, felt like leaving unlocked rooms unlit, and he wasn't doing that anymore. The category he kept coming back to was the one labeled, in his own mental shorthand, what I am. Not in an existential sense. Practically. Specifically. What he was capable of. He knew about his parents now, the real versions, not the soft-edged myth of the martyred couple, but James and Lily Potter as actual human beings with specific qualities and specific power. His father had been one of the most gifted natural transfigurers of his generation, an animagus at 15, plural complex transfigurations at will, the kind of instinctive understanding of form and structure that usually took decades to develop. His mother had been something rarer, a genuinely exceptional magical theorist with an intuitive grasp of charm construction and a particular affinity for protection magic that Flitwick, who had taught her, had reportedly called the strongest innate talent for ward work he'd seen in 40 years of teaching. Harry had both. Not one or the other, both, from both sides, in combination, in a child who had also survived a rebounding killing curse at 14 months old and whose magical core had absorbed part of the resulting magical discharge rather than being destroyed by it. That was the part Dumbledore had tested 3 days after the attack. That was the part that had made him act so quickly, so thoroughly, so early. Harry understood it now without needing the emotional reaction. Dumbledore had found a child with a composite magical gift that exceeded his parents individually, carrying additional power from the curse rebound, and had immediately understood 2 things. First, that this child would be extraordinarily difficult to defeat if he ever understood and used what he had. Second, that this child, if properly shaped, kept ignorant, kept small, kept dependent and uncertain, could be directed toward a confrontation that Dumbledore could control, at a time Dumbledore could choose, with an outcome Dumbledore could predict. Harry was the most powerful piece on the board. Dumbledore had made sure he didn't know he was a piece. "You've got that face again," Ron said from the floor. "Which face?" "The one where you're about to say something that makes me understand why everyone keeps looking at you like you're a weather event." Harry looked down at him. "I was thinking about what Dumbledore understood when he tested me at 14 months. Ron shifted onto his elbow. "And?" "He knew," Harry said simply. "Before I was 2 years old, he knew what I was going to be capable of, and instead of doing anything useful with that information, instead of preparing me properly or giving me the tools to protect myself or telling me the truth, he spent 10 years carefully making sure I was as small and manageable as possible." Hermione's book closed. She looked at him over the top of it. Because a Harry who knew himself couldn't be controlled. Because a Harry who knew himself would have asked questions, Harry said. Would have wanted agency. Would have made his own choices about the prophecy, about the war, about what role he wanted to play. "And what role do you want to play?" Hermione asked. "Now that you get to choose." Harry thought about it honestly. Not the reflexive answer, not the performance of reluctant heroism he'd seen in enough stories to recognize the shape of. What did he actually want? "I want Voldemort gone," he said. "Not because a prophecy says so. Because he's a genuine threat and I'm capable of addressing it, and letting it fester because I wasn't properly prepared is worse than engaging it. But I want it on my terms. My timeline. My choices." He paused. "And I want Dumbledore held accountable. Not because I hate him. Because accountability is what stops the next person from doing the same thing to the next child they decide their plan requires." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. "That's remarkably clear-headed." "I've had 2 days with no blocks," Harry said. "It turns out I think quite well when nobody's suppressing it." Ron snorted from the floor. "Can we eat something? All of this is very important, but I've been on this floor for 2 hours. "You're on the floor because you chose to lie on the floor," Hermione said. "I'm on the floor because these chairs are brutal." Hogwarts was apparently designed by someone who thought comfort was morally suspect. He sat up. "Dinner?" The great hall at dinner was a different place than it had been 4 days ago. The energy had changed. Not dramatically, the food appeared, the candles burned, the enchanted ceiling showed a cloud-heavy Wednesday sky, but underneath the ordinary surface was a new quality of attention, a heightened self-consciousness in how people moved and spoke, as if everyone was aware that the normal rules of the room had been recently renegotiated and nobody was entirely sure what the new rules were. Harry noticed it from the moment he walked in. Noticed, specifically, that he was noticed, not in the celebrity sense he'd experienced at King's Cross, that bright reflexive excitement, but in a different way. People looked at him with the careful attention of people who were trying to take accurate readings, and some of what they read seemed to confuse them, which he understood. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't being careful or strategic about presentation. He was just himself, and apparently himself was something that took recalibration to perceive accurately. Neville Longbottom appeared at his elbow before he'd sat down. Neville had a specific quality about him that Harry had noticed on the boat over, a kind of perpetual bracing, as if he was always half expecting something to fall on him. He held his shoulders in, took up as little space as possible, and had a way of beginning sentences that suggested he was already apologizing for them. He was, Harry thought, someone who had been told he wasn't enough for long enough that the message had lodged somewhere structural. Harry recognized it. He'd felt that way himself, until about 72 hours ago. Harry, Neville said, with the caution of someone approaching something they'd been told might bite. Can I wanted to ask, he stopped. Sorry. I can come back. Don't be sorry, Harry said. Ask. Neville blinked, like the directness was unexpected. The memory blocks, he said. The thing the charm found. He paused. I was reading about it. About what they do. And I was wondering, he stopped again, visibly wrangling something. Harry looked at him. He thought about the quality of Neville's bracing. He thought about what it looked like from the outside when someone had been consistently undersold on themselves for years. Neville, he said. Have you ever felt like you're less capable than you should be? Like you understand things a step slower than you expect to? Like magic that should be straightforward is harder than it ought to be? Neville stared at him. All the time, he said quietly. Then I think you should talk to McGonagall, Harry said. I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm saying it's worth asking the question. Neville was very still. Then he said, my gran says I'm just not as talented as my parents were. Maybe, Harry said. Or maybe someone decided it was convenient for people to believe that. He left Neville standing there with that, and went to sit with Ron and Hermione, and didn't look back. He heard Neville sit down at the Gryffindor table a moment later, not near them, and heard the quality of the silence around Neville that was different from before, more interior, more focused, like someone had just handed him a door and told him it was allowed to open. What was that? Hermione asked, watching him. A possibility, Harry said. He ate his dinner. Around him the great hall hummed with its new quality of charged attention, and he was aware of Draco Malfoy watching him from the Slytherin table with an expression of concentrated calculation, and of the fifth-year prefect Percy Weasley watching him from the Gryffindor end with a mixture of admiration and something approaching wariness, and of Snape at the staff table not appearing to watch him at all, which meant he was. Snape had been complicated since Monday. Not hostile. Not his usual brand of precise, targeted academic contempt, which Harry had been on the receiving end of in potions on Tuesday and had found considerably less effective than intended, partly because he now understood enough about potion-making to answer Snape's deliberate traps correctly and partly because he'd spent enough time in his newly opened memory rooms to understand that Snape's contempt was never really about the target. It was about something older. But there had been a moment, in the corridor after potions, when Harry had turned to find Snape watching him with an expression he hadn't had time to compose. It was gone in an instant, replaced by the habitual blankness that Snape wore like a second skin, but Harry had seen it, and what it had been, unmistakably, was something close to grief. He filed that away too. It was important in a way he couldn't fully articulate yet. Thursday morning arrived with the specific quality of mornings that know they are significant. Harry was up at 5:30, not because he'd slept badly but because his mind had already been working for several hours and the pretense of sleep had become unproductive. He dressed in the quiet dormitory, Ron sleeping with the total commitment of someone who'd been unconscious for 8 hours and wasn't finished, and went down to the common room. McGonagall was waiting for him. She was sitting in the chair by the fire with a cup of tea that was still steaming and a parchment on her knee, and she didn't look surprised to see him at 5:30, which told him she'd expected this. "You should have slept more," she said. "I slept enough," he said. She looked at him with that inventory attention and evidently decided he was telling the truth. "Sit down. There are things we should go through before we leave." He sat. She passed him a cup of tea, she'd had a second one ready, which confirmed the expectation, and looked at the parchment on her knee. "The hearing structure," she said. "A preliminary Wisengamot hearing is not a full trial. It's a determination of whether sufficient evidence exists to warrant a full trial. The procedure is formally, evidence presentation by the law enforcement side, response by the defense, questions from the panel, ruling." She looked up. "In practice, it will be considerably messier than that, because Dumbledore's defense team is led by Bartemius Crouch Sr., who is one of the most technically capable magical lawyers in Britain, and because there will be political pressure on the panel from multiple directions." "Crouch," Harry said. He had the name from his recovered memories, a hard man, a man who had bent the law in the direction of his convictions before and would frame doing so as principle. "He'll try to argue necessity. He'll argue necessity, proportionality, and precedent," McGonagall said. "He'll argue that Dumbledore acted within the legitimate scope of his authority as Chief Warlock of the Wisengamot, which granted him certain, very limited, but extant, powers of extraordinary intervention in cases of national security." She set the parchment down. "Amelia Bones will argue that those powers extend to documented threats, not to unilateral assessments of future risk applied to an infant." "He blocked me at 14 months, Harry said. "Before I could even be assessed as a threat to anything." "Precisely." She looked at him. "That is the core of the prosecution's argument. Not that Dumbledore lacks authority in emergencies. But that what he did to you was not emergency intervention. It was engineering. Long-term, deliberate, premeditated cognitive suppression of a child for the purpose of producing a specific outcome in a conflict that didn't yet exist in any material form." She paused. "It's a strong argument, legally. Bones believes it will succeed. Do you?" Harry asked. McGonagall was quiet for a moment. "I believe the law supports it," she said. "I am less certain about the people applying the law." She looked at the fire. "Dumbledore has sat on the Wisengamot for 40 years. He appointed several of its current members in his capacity as Chief Warlock. Some of them owe him things that aren't recorded anywhere." She turned back to Harry. "The evidence is unambiguous. That doesn't mean the people evaluating it will be. So what do I do?" Harry asked. "Tell the truth," McGonagall said. "Clearly, directly, without performance. The truth is damning enough. It doesn't require decoration." Harry nodded. He thought about what Amelia Bones had said about people trying to put the blocks back. He thought about the owls with their careful, crafted letters. He thought about the 34 rooms, all open now, all lit. "There's something you should know before we go," he said. McGonagall waited. "I've been testing things," Harry said. "The last 2 days. Not systematically, I don't have access to the right space for systematic, but enough to get an accurate picture." He wrapped his hands around the teacup. "It's more than Voss described. More than Bones described. I don't think they had the full picture, even after the assessments, because the settling is still happening." He paused. "Yesterday evening, after dinner, I went to one of the abandoned classrooms on the 3rd floor." McGonagall's expression was carefully neutral. "And?" I spent an hour working through every charm and transfiguration I can now remember from the recovered memories. He thought about how to describe it. The accuracy is complete. Every technique I theoretically know, I can execute. There's no gap between knowing and doing, it's just there. He paused. The scale is what surprised me. I was working at the far end of the classroom and affecting things at the other end. Precisely. Without additional effort. McGonagall said nothing. I also tried something I wasn't sure would work, Harry said. There's a class of protective enchantment, advanced ward work, the kind my mother apparently specialized in. I'd recovered the theory but I wasn't sure if the theory would translate at this level. He paused. I constructed a ward around the classroom. Floor, ceiling, walls. Full perimeter. He met her eyes. It took about 90 seconds. And when I walked out and looked at it from the corridor, it was, Hermione calls it unbreachable. She couldn't get through it. I had to let her in. McGonagall had gone very still. That's 7th year content, she said quietly. Newt level. For exceptional students. I know, Harry said. You're 11 years old, she said. Not as a reproach. As a fact she was placing accurately into context. I know that too, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled between them, and outside the common room windows, the pre-dawn grounds of Hogwarts were dark and still, the lake invisible, the forest present only as a darker darkness. Are you frightened? She asked. Not of the hearing. Not of Dumbledore's lawyers. Not of the Wisengamot. He understood that. No, he said honestly. Good, she said, and the word was firm and clear, the way she said things that mattered. You don't need to be. Whatever they try in that room today, the evidence is the evidence, your testimony is your testimony, and no amount of institutional loyalty changes what that charm found. She paused. But I want to say this clearly, and I want you to hear it, whatever you're capable of, whatever the measurements say, whatever the rooms you've opened contain, that's yours. No one gets to decide what to do with it except you. Her voice was level but the meaning was dense. Not Dumbledore's vision, not Voldemort's designs, not the Ministry's politics, not my preferences. She held his gaze. Yours. Harry held her gaze back. The fire moved between them. Outside, a cloud shifted and the first gray edge of morning touched the top of the forest. I know, he said. And then, because it was true and because she had earned it, thank you. She nodded once. Finished her tea. Set the cup down with a precise, final click. Get your cloak, she said. We leave at 6. The Ministry of Magic was underground and enormous and felt, to Harry, like a place that had been designed to communicate power through scale, the gilded ceilings, the elaborate fireplaces, the floor mosaic of wizards and creatures arranged in a hierarchy that told you, in the first 5 seconds, exactly how the people who built this building thought the world was organized. He walked through it with McGonagall at his side and Aurors in front and behind, and he looked at all of it with the clear attention of someone who has stopped pretending to see less than he does. Amelia Bones met them at the entrance to the lower levels, where the courtrooms were, where Harry's memories told him people sat in chairs with chains that bound automatically, where Dumbledore had held trials during Voldemort's war that had bent the rules of evidence into interesting shapes. She was already in her official robes, severe and correct, with the monocle in place and a sheaf of parchment under one arm. The panel has 9 members, she said, falling into step beside them. Of the 9, I assessed 3 as reliable neutrals, 2 as sympathetic to the prosecution, and 4 as potentially sympathetic to the defense. She didn't slow down or soften this information. Our job today is to move at least one of those 4. The evidence will do most of the work. Your testimony will do the rest. What do they want to believe? Harry asked. The 4. Bones glanced at him. They want to believe that Dumbledore's methods, while extreme, were understandable given the circumstances. That he acted from genuine love and strategic necessity rather than manipulation. That the wizarding world's greatest protector shouldn't be destroyed for choices made during existential threat. And I need to show them that protector is a story, he told them, Harry said. You need to show them what it actually cost, Bones said. The specific cost. To you, specifically, as a child. Abstract discussions of institutional ethics and legal frameworks don't move people. A clear-eyed 11-year-old telling a Wizengamot panel what was taken from him at 14 months old, that moves people. Harry nodded. He thought, clear-eyed. Yes. They turned a corner and the corridor opened into an anteroom outside the main hearing chamber, and there was Dumbledore. He was standing with his legal team, 3 people in dark robes, including the man Harry recognized from his recovered memories as Bartemius Crouch, severe and silver-haired. Dumbledore himself was in simple robes, not the elaborate ones Harry associated with him, and he stood with his hands clasped before him and his silver bindings visible at his wrists, and he looked composed. That was the word. Composed, and sad, and entirely certain that he understood the room better than anyone else in it. He saw Harry. For a moment the anteroom was very still. Harry looked at him. He didn't feel what he'd been half expecting to feel, the complicated mixture of betrayal and residual misplaced affection, the child's confused loyalty to the adult who had nevertheless shaped his world. What he felt instead was clear and structural. He saw Dumbledore precisely, a man of genuine brilliance and genuine conviction who had made choices about Harry's life that were not his to make, and who stood here now with the settled composure of someone who still believed, on some level, that if he could just explain it properly, everyone would understand. Harry, Dumbledore said. His voice was what it always was, warm, deep, carefully calibrated to the frequency of trustworthiness. I want you to know, not now, Harry said. Dumbledore blinked. A small thing, barely perceptible. But Harry saw it, the slight recalibration of a man who had expected a different response and was adjusting. This isn't the place, Harry said. And I don't need whatever you're about to tell me. I have my memories back. I know why you did it. He paused. I just think you were wrong. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The brilliant blue eyes, still sharp, still deep, reading him with the attention of a master strategist encountering something he hadn't fully modeled. You are remarkably composed, Dumbledore said quietly. For someone who has been through what you have been through. That's because you didn't get to finish, Harry said. 11 years wasn't quite long enough. He walked past him into the hearing chamber. The chamber was exactly as his recovered memories described it, high stone walls, tiered seating for the panel, a single chair in the center with arms that were designed for chains that weren't currently in evidence. 9 witches and wizards in the panel seats, watching him as he came in. To one side, a long table for the prosecution, where Bones was already arranging parchment with brisk efficiency. To the other, the defense table, where Crouch and his team would sit. McGonagall took a seat behind the prosecution table. Tonks settled against the wall. The Aurors distributed themselves around the room with the quiet competence of people who were present as a signal rather than an expectation. Harry sat in the chair. It didn't try to chain him. He checked, precisely, with a small application of the awareness he'd been developing for 2 days, running a quiet sense across the enchantments of the chair, mapping them the way you'd run your hand along a surface to feel its texture. The binding enchantment was there but passive. Dormant. He sat straight, hands in his lap, and looked at the 9 members of the panel, and waited. The one in the center, a witch in her 60s with a sharp jaw and reading glasses, introduced herself as senior Wizengamot member Griselda Marchbanks, presiding. She ran through the formal elements of the procedure with practiced efficiency, and Harry listened and noted and assessed. 3 neutral faces, 2 leaning toward him, for that were doing the thing people do when they've already decided what they want to conclude and are organizing their expression around that conclusion. He had 1 target. Not 4. He only needed 1, and he'd identified it already. A wizard on the far left of the panel, heavy-set and gray-bearded, who kept looking at Harry with the particular quality of someone trying to reconcile two things that weren't reconciling. He was sympathetic to Dumbledore, the tension in his shoulders said he wanted to be loyal, but there was something underneath that. Some compartment of him that was looking at an 11-year-old boy in a chair that had been designed for criminals and was doing arithmetic that wasn't coming out clean. Harry watched him and thought, "You'll do." Bones stood up and began to speak, and she was extraordinary. She presented the evidence with the clear, clean precision of someone who understood that the facts didn't need theatrical assistance, each piece placed carefully, each connection drawn explicitly, the forensic evidence of the blocks given its full legal weight without being dramatized. She spoke for 35 minutes and when she sat down the chamber was completely silent. Crouch stood up and Harry watched him work. He was good. Harry had known he would be good, but seeing it in practice was different from expecting it. Crouch built his defense like a wall, Dumbledore's history of service, the existential threat of Voldemort's war, the legitimate scope of extraordinary intervention, the genuine impossibility of the choices facing the wizarding world's primary defender during years of genuine existential threat. He was not dismissing the blocks. He was reframing them as desperate measures taken under conditions that those sitting in safety years later could not fully appreciate. He was saying, a great man made difficult choices. Is that a crime? The gray-bearded wizard on the far left was listening carefully. His expression was not shifting. Not yet. Then Marchbanks said, "Mr. Potter. You may give your statement." Harry stood up, and the room changed quality the way rooms do when a specific person moves in them, not theatrical, not performed, just a shift in the distribution of attention that was difficult to explain and impossible to ignore. He thought about what Bones had said. Clear-eyed. Specific. The actual cost. "I'm 11 years old," he said. "I started at Hogwarts 4 days ago. Before that I lived with my aunt and uncle in Surrey, and before that I lived with my aunt and uncle in Surrey, and before that I lived with my aunt and uncle in Surrey." He paused. "I had one life. The one life I could access. 34 blocks meant that the 11 years I lived were a narrow corridor of my actual experience, and I walked down it thinking it was the whole building. The chamber was very still. I didn't know my parents properly. Not the real versions, who they were, what they could do, what they'd valued, what they'd sacrificed. I had the story Dumbledore's framing allowed me to have, which was, they died for you. Be grateful and don't ask questions." He kept his voice level. "Not performing grief. Reporting it. I didn't know what I was capable of. Every time I felt something extraordinary, some instinct told me to push it down, keep it small, don't show anyone. That instinct wasn't mine. It was installed. I spent 11 years following instructions I didn't know were instructions." The gray-bearded wizard's hands had changed position on the armrests. "Most of all," Harry said, "I didn't know I had choices. About the prophecy. About the war. About my role in a conflict that Dumbledore decided I was destined for before I was 2 years old." He looked directly at the panel. "He didn't block me because I was dangerous. He blocked me because a child who knows himself, who knows what he can do and what he's worth, who knows he has options, that child makes his own choices. And Dumbledore needed me to make his choices." He paused. He needed a weapon, and the safest kind of weapon is one that doesn't know it's a weapon. Complete, total silence. Then Harry looked at Dumbledore, sitting at the defense table with his hands clasped on the surface and his composure intact but something moving behind his eyes, something that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite justification. Some complicated admixture of all three. "I don't hate him," Harry said. "I want to be clear about that. I think he believes every choice he made was necessary. I think he loves the wizarding world and I think he believed he was protecting it." He held Dumbledore's gaze for one more second. "But you don't get to love someone and make every decision about their life without their knowledge. Those things aren't compatible. And the fact that his intentions were good makes it more important, not less, that the limits of his authority are clearly established. Because the next person who does this may not have intentions as clean as his. He sat down. The gray-bearded wizard was staring at him. Marchbanks said, very carefully, "Thank you, Mr. Potter." And in her voice was the quality of someone who had just heard something they hadn't expected and were deciding what to do with it. Harry sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling of the chamber, high and stone gray, and thought, first day. There were more days coming. Outside afterward, in the corridor, McGonagall found him. She walked next to him without speaking for a moment, which was the correct instinct. Then she said, "You look directly at him." "I know. Most people can't," she said. "Even adults. Even people who've had years to prepare. There's something about the quality of his presence." "I know what the quality of his presence is," Harry said. "I understand how he does it. The calibration, the warmth, the sense that he sees you more clearly than anyone else sees you." He paused. "It only works if you want to believe it. I've decided not to want to." McGonagall was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "I wish I'd done the same 20 years ago." "You did it 4 days ago," Harry said. "That counts." She didn't reply to that directly. But when they turned the corner and the exit of the ministry came into view, he heard her exhale, slow and deep, the sound of something long carried, being set down. Chapter 4, Testimony. The full trial was set for Monday. Marchbanks had announced it at the close of Thursday's preliminary hearing, after 40 minutes of deliberation, that Harry had spent in the ministry anteroom eating a sandwich Tonks had conjured from somewhere and watching Ron attempt to explain Quidditch to a confused ministry clerk. The ruling had been unanimous, which Bones had told him afterward was not what she'd predicted. She'd predicted 7-2, had hoped for 8-1, and had gotten 9-0, and the quality of her not-quite smile when she reported this told Harry exactly how unusual that was. "Crouch put in a good argument," she'd said. "He did," Harry had agreed. "Yours was better." He hadn't said anything to that. He didn't need to. The weekend between the preliminary and the full trial had the specific texture of weather before a storm, the surface appearing ordinary while everything underneath built toward something. Harry moved through it normally, classes on Friday, meals in the Great Hall, an evening in the common room where he and Ron and Hermione had commandeered the table by the window and worked through homework that felt slightly surreal given everything else happening. Saturday morning he'd trained. Sunday he'd talked to Neville. But first, Friday. Friday was potions. Snape's classroom was in the dungeons, and it was cold the way dungeons are cold, not the clean cold of the outside but a deep, stone-stored cold that had been accumulating since the castle was built and wasn't interested in the preferences of the people currently occupying it. The desks were scarred and dark, the shelves along the walls dense with jars of things that floated or desiccated or had the particular quality of things best not looked at too long. It smelled of something bitter and complex and very old. Harry liked it, actually. He didn't tell anyone. He'd found that he had a significant instinct for potions. It was the subject Snape had been most aggressively trying to trip him on, because Snape's tactical approach to Harry had been to ask questions he expected Harry not to know the answer to. But Harry knew all the answers now, and more than that, he understood the why of them, which meant the answers came with context and application rather than bare recitation. On Friday, Snape had put a question to the class about the properties of bezoars that was technically first-year content but practically ahead of where most first-years would be, and Harry had answered it, and then answered the 3 follow-up questions that Snape had aimed at him with increasing precision, and then, because Snape had paused and there was a 5th question visible in the structure of the 4th, said the 5th answer before the question was asked. The classroom had gone completely silent. Snape had looked at him for a full 4 seconds. Not with the focused contempt he deployed so reliably on other students. With something that was recalibrating in real time, and not particularly comfortable with the process. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said, which was apparently the only acceptable response to the situation. Try not to make a habit of finishing my sentences, Mr. Potter. I'll do my best, Harry said, which was honest in the sense that he would in fact try, and which Snape clearly recognized as not a promise. After class, in the corridor again, the moment repeated itself. Harry turned and found Snape watching him. And again the expression was there and gone in an instant, but Harry was getting better at reading the instant. It wasn't just grief this time. It was something more active. An assessment, rapidly completed and filed away. Harry thought about what he knew about Snape now, from the recovered memories. The category his memories had labeled, in his own shorthand, complicated people who were present at my origin. His mother had known Snape. Had trusted him, in the specific way she trusted very few people, not easily, not with the warmth she gave broadly, but with the kind of trust that settles deep and doesn't shift. There were fragments in Harry's recovered memories that he was still examining carefully, still turning over, still trying to understand the edges of. Snape had been Lily's closest friend for a significant portion of her childhood. Had loved her, in the way that complicated people love other complicated people, entirely and helplessly and badly. Had made choices afterward that he'd spent years trying to balance against that love. Harry hadn't decided yet what to do with this information. But he'd decided not to ignore it. Saturday morning he found an empty room on the 7th floor. He'd heard about the room of requirement from his recovered memories, a room that became what the user needed, discoverable by walking past a certain stretch of wall 3 times while concentrating on the specific requirement. He'd tried it with a clear, specific need, a training space, large, with a full range of obstacles and no ceiling restrictions and walls that could absorb impact without damage. The room that appeared was enormous. It had the quality of a space that had been imagining training for centuries and was pleased to finally demonstrate its full range. He spent 3 hours there, alone. He worked through every technique he'd recovered, charms, transfiguration, wards, a handful of things that didn't fit neatly into any official category but that his recovered memories labeled under his mother's shorthand as structural magic, the kind that operated on the deep architecture of physical reality rather than on the surface effects most spells addressed. He tested range and precision and application and, carefully, because the results required space, scale. By the end of the 3 hours he understood the full picture clearly. Not everything he knew could he do at full competence yet. Some techniques required practice, the theoretical knowledge was there but the physical execution needed repetition to become automatic. But the ceiling was visible, and it was very high, and getting there was a matter of time and work rather than inherent capacity. There were also things he could do right now that he hadn't fully anticipated. The ward construction, which he'd tested in the empty classroom on Wednesday, was faster now than it had been then, settling into the settled river quality that the other techniques had, the gap between intention and execution closing with each application. He built a full perimeter ward around the training room, then took it apart cleanly, then built it again differently, then modified it from the outside to add a specific layer of notification, a variant of his mother's signature technique, a charm that would tell him not just that someone had attempted breach but who and how. He modified that layer twice, refining it, and the refinements came intuitively, emerging from the structure of what he already knew. He also tested something he hadn't expected to be able to do yet, and which, when it worked, made him sit down on the floor and stare at the wall for 5 minutes. Wandless. Not the small wandless manifestations he'd been doing accidentally his whole life, he'd always had those, they were precisely the things Dumbledore had been trying to contain. This was deliberate, precise, full-scale wandless spellwork. He'd thought of it as a theoretical option and reached for it without his wand and the charm had come, clean and complete. He sat on the floor and thought about that. Then he stood up and did it again. Then he did it 12 more times with 12 different charms, and by the 12th the consistency was solid enough to call reliable, and he filed this information carefully in the same mental directory as everything else, not with pride, exactly. With the particular satisfaction of something understood correctly. He walked back through the castle to the common room and found Hermione waiting with new legal parchment and Ron waiting with a slightly guilty expression and a plate of biscuits he'd clearly appropriated from somewhere. "Where did you get those?" Harry said. "The house elves are very generous," Ron said. "I think they appreciate the direct approach." He held the plate out. How did it go? Harry took a biscuit. Good, he said. Hermione looked at him over her parchment with the expression she reserved for good when it meant something considerably more than good. How good? We should probably talk about that before Monday, Harry said. Sunday afternoon, Neville. Harry found him in the courtyard, sitting alone on a bench with a herbology textbook open on his knees and the expression of someone engaging in an activity not because they want to but because sitting with their own thoughts is currently worse. Harry sat down next to him without preamble. Neville looked up with the slightly startled expression of someone who'd been half expecting to be left alone. Did you talk to McGonagall? Harry asked. Neville closed the textbook on his thumb to keep the page. She came and found me, actually, he said. Friday morning. She said she wanted to run the detection charm on me specifically. She said precautionary. He paused. My Gran was very upset about the idea. McGonagall told her and she wrote back immediately and the reply was, he stopped. What? She said it was ridiculous and that there was nothing wrong with me that more effort wouldn't fix. Neville's voice was carefully neutral in the specific way that neutral is when it's doing very heavy lifting. She said Dumbledore was a great man and the accusations were politically motivated and that I should focus on my studies. Harry looked at him. He thought about what Neville's parents were, currently, not in the past tense. Frank and Alice Longbottom, in St. Mungo's, had been there since Neville was a baby, their minds destroyed by Bellatrix Lestrange's curse. He thought about what it meant to grow up with that as the defining fact of your family. What shape it would give to the space where normal parental confidence would have been. He thought about Dumbledore's blocks on himself at 14 months, and he thought about what purpose it might serve, for Dumbledore's purposes, to have the boy who had also been marked by prophecy, the other candidate, the road not taken, who had grown up believing himself to be unremarkable. Did McGonagall run the charm? Harry asked. Neville was very still. She ran it anyway, he said quietly. She said parental consent for the standard detection charm is only required for students under 8, and that my Gran's opinion, while noted, was not legally applicable. He paused. She ran it on Friday afternoon. And? Neville opened the herbology textbook, looked at the page he hadn't been reading, closed it again. 6 blocks, he said. All the same signature. The courtyard was quiet around them, the mid-autumn Sunday emptiness, the sky a flat white-gray, the distant sound of students somewhere else. A pigeon landed on the far wall and studied them with the complete lack of concern of a creature that has outsourced all its survival anxiety to the urban environment. 6, Harry said. I know it's not the same as yours, Neville said quickly, with the reflex of someone who's been taught that his experiences don't warrant as much space as other people's. 34 is, I know it's not the same. It doesn't matter what the number is, Harry said. 6 or 34, someone went into your head without permission and took things. That's what matters. He paused. What did McGonagall say about them? Neville looked up. The expression on his face was doing several things simultaneously, some combination of the dawning intensity of someone who's been given permission to believe something they'd suppressed, and the specific, precarious quality of hope in someone who's been disappointed enough times to be wary of it. She said 2 of them were skill blocks, Neville said. On magical intuition and casting instinct. And she said, he stopped. She said the results indicated that without the blocks I'd probably be in the top third of my year for charms. He said it like he was expecting someone to take it back. Maybe higher. Do you believe her? Harry asked. Neville was quiet for a moment. I want to, he said. That's a start, Harry said. He meant it exactly as he'd meant it when he'd thought the same thing about himself, standing in his hospital room at 2:47 in the morning. Wanting to believe was the beginning of the architecture. Have they been removed? Not yet. She's waiting for my Gran's consent or a court order, whichever comes first. A pause. She said she was very strongly leaning toward the court order. I'll put in a word with Bones, Harry said. Neville looked at him with an expression that had the specific quality of someone encountering unexpected help and not quite knowing what to do with the shape of it. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, Harry said. I'm going to. He stood up from the bench. You should eat something. The thing about having support is you have to be functional enough to receive it. Neville stared at him for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not a transformation, but the kind of small fundamental movement that is actually enormous. Like a door opening an inch. Okay, he said. Harry nodded and walked back toward the castle. Behind him he heard Neville stand up, and the sound of the herbology textbook being put into a bag rather than held anxiously in hand, and he thought, one more room, beginning to open. Sunday evening, Hermione found him in the library. She sat down across from him with the expression she wore when she'd found something important and had been waiting for the right moment to present it. This was differentiated from her excited discovery expression by a quality of weight. Whatever she'd found wasn't celebratory. What? Harry said. She put a piece of parchment on the table between them. It was covered in her handwriting, dense and precise, with references noted in the margins. I've been cross-referencing the legal records from Dumbledore's time as Chief Warlock against the Magical Child Welfare Act, she said. Specifically looking for other instances of the detection charm being used during his tenure. And it wasn't used, she said. Between 1970 and last Monday, the detection charm was not deployed at Hogwarts or at any ministry-affiliated institution for new student intake. She tapped the parchment. The protocol McGonagall implemented was new. The Board of Governors approved it over the summer, during the period when his authority over certain administrative decisions was being reviewed following some unrelated complaints. She held Harry's gaze. He'd been Chief Warlock for 40 years. He'd sat on the Board of Governors for 40 years. The detection protocol was never implemented while he had influence over both bodies. Harry looked at the parchment. He made sure it was never used, he said. The timing is too consistent to be coincidental, Hermione said. And I found one more thing. She flipped the parchment over. The reverse side was covered in a different kind of notation, dates and names and small interconnected circles that she'd been using to map something. The Magical Child Welfare Act has a provision, Section 14, subsection 3, requiring annual detection screenings for all children in the care of non-magical guardians, starting from 1982. She paused. That requirement was never enforced for you. The family assessment visits that should have happened annually, no record of them. The mandatory 5-year welfare review, no record. She looked at him steadily. Someone ensured that the standard oversight mechanisms didn't apply to you. The library was quiet around them. Madame Pants was at her desk at the far end, attending to something that was not them, which was as much privacy as the library generally offered. He buried it comprehensively, Harry said. He had the authority and the position to do it quietly, Hermione said. Nobody who might have questioned it had access to enough of the picture to see the pattern. She paused. Until now. This goes in Bones' file, Harry said. I've already copied it, Hermione said, producing a second, identical piece of parchment from inside her robes with the efficiency of someone who planned 3 steps ahead as a matter of course. She should have it before the trial. Harry took the parchment. He looked at the interconnected circles, the dates, the pattern Hermione had mapped with the focused attention of someone who genuinely believed in the power of accurate information to do good. He thought about how extraordinary it was, how specific and particular and human it was, that she had spent her weekend doing this. Not because anyone asked her to. Because it was the right thing and she had the ability, and those two facts together meant she didn't need a third reason. Hermione, he said. She looked up. Thank you, he said. Genuinely. She blinked once. Then she said, with the precision of someone who doesn't take compliments easily and doesn't intend to make a production of receiving them, we're friends. This is what friends do. She closed her notebook. Now go to sleep. You have a trial tomorrow. Monday morning arrived cold and certain. November had appeared overnight with the commitment of a season that had been waiting patiently and intended to be taken seriously. The grounds of Hogwarts were stiff with the first hard frost, each blade of grass outlined in white, the lake dark and still under a sky the color of pewter. Harry ate breakfast. Properly, eggs and toast and tea and enough that his body had something to work with. Ron sat next to him and ate with matching thoroughness and said nothing consequential, which was the perfect thing to do. Hermione ate less than she should and reviewed her notes 3 times and then caught herself and put them away. McGonagall appeared at 7:45. The Aurors are at the gates, she said. When you're ready. Harry stood. Around the Gryffindor table, several people were watching him, not the celebrity watching from the first day but something different, something more complex. Neville, 2 seats down, caught his eye and gave a very small nod. Harry nodded back. He walked out of the great hall and the cold morning air came at him from the open doors and he walked into it. The courtroom was the same and different. The same stone walls, the same tiered seating, the same chair in the center. But full trial meant full Wizengamot, and full Wizengamot meant 32 members rather than 9, a gallery of observers above the chamber floor, ministry officials at a separate table, and the kind of institutional gravity that comes from a room full of people who understand they are participating in something historically significant and aren't sure how they feel about it. The chair this time had chains. They lay coiled around the armrests, dormant, but present. Harry sat in it and felt the dormancy of them, a passive enchantment waiting for an activation signal that had never come, because a witness was not a prisoner, but the architects of this room had been interested in the reminder. He looked at the chains and thought, not for me. They didn't move. Dumbledore was already at the defense table. He wore his more elaborate robes today, deep blue, with the familiar touches of silver. His demeanor was the same as it had been Thursday, settled and composed, but Harry noticed something different in it today. A quality of decision. As if between Thursday and Monday Dumbledore had completed an internal process and arrived at a settled position. He knew what that position was going to be. He'd been thinking about it all weekend. Marchbanks called the trial to order. She ran through the formalities with the brisk precision of someone who had presided over enough of these to have reduced the formalities to their functional minimum. Evidence was entered, the detection charm report, the forensic analysis of the magical signatures, the block removal records from St. Mungo's, the healer's assessments, and, Harry saw the moment Crouch registered it, Hermione's research parchment, submitted by Bones as supplementary material documenting the systematic suppression of the mandatory welfare oversight procedures. Crouch registered it with a stillness that was itself a response. Bones presented the case. She was better in the full trial than she'd been in the preliminary hearing, she'd always been good, but today there was an additional clarity to it, like a lens brought into final focus. She presented the evidence as a structure, each piece supporting the next, building toward the point she wanted the chamber to occupy, that this was not an impulsive decision, not a desperate measure, not an act of wartime extremity. This was a sustained, deliberate, carefully maintained program of cognitive suppression targeting a child from infancy. This was architecture, not accident. When she sat down, Crouch stood. He was, Harry thought, the best kind of opponent. He didn't panic, didn't overreach, didn't try to dismiss what couldn't be dismissed. Instead he built the alternative frame with precision, the world of 1981, the genuine existential threat, the choices that couldn't be made cleanly from the safety of peacetime retrospective. He humanized Dumbledore without sentimentalizing him, which was the harder and more effective technique. He acknowledged the blocks existed. He argued that their existence was evidence of the weight of the decisions Dumbledore had carried, not the lightness of them. He was good. He was very good. And when he sat down and Marchbanks said, "Mr. Potter," and Harry stood up, he felt the room change quality the same way it had on Thursday. He looked at the 32 Wizengamot members in their purple robes. He looked at the gallery above them, silent and watching. He looked at the ministry officials, some of whom were trying not to look back at him, including a round-faced man in green who had the quality of a person who has been hoping to avoid this exact moment and hasn't quite managed to be strategic enough about it. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked back. The same quality of decision in his eyes, the settled, completed position. And Harry understood now what it was. Dumbledore was going to tell the truth. Not the full truth, not freely, but if cornered by evidence that was forensic and unarguable, he was going to tell the truth, because Dumbledore had always believed, on some fundamental level, that if the full truth was known, people would understand. Would see what he'd seen. Would arrive at the same conclusions. That was his deepest miscalculation. Harry saw it clearly. "I was 14 months old," Harry said. The chamber was so quiet his own voice sounded strange to him, not amplified but present, occupying the space precisely. "When the first block was installed, I was 14 months old. I don't have a memory of it. I can't testify to how it felt or what was taken in that specific moment, because I wasn't old enough to know what was happening." He paused. "But I can tell you what the 11 years afterward felt like. All of them, with clarity, now that the blocks are gone." He told them. Not the shape of it, not the summary, he told them specifically. He told them about being 6 and crying in the cupboard and knowing something was wrong and that certainty being taken. He told them about being 8 and reading the magical primer and feeling recognition so complete it was like reading about himself, and the block coming down on that, and spending the next 3 years believing that magic was something that happened to him rather than something that was him. He told them about every accidental manifestation, the glass tank at the zoo, the roof incident, the teacher's hair, and how after each one he'd felt a flash of something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite excitement, and then the flash would be covered over, and he'd forget what it meant, and go back to being small. He told them about the 11 years of the Dursleys, which were not entirely Dumbledore's fault but were entirely Dumbledore's choice, and how knowing that his magical community existed and valued him might have changed the quality of those years, and how that knowledge had been specifically and deliberately blocked. He told them about the vault. The Gringotts vault in his name that he'd never been told about, that a 7-year-old who got new shoes once a year in second-hand sizes might have found some comfort in knowing existed, if the man who decided where that child lived had thought the child's comfort was relevant to the plan. He told them about the prophecy. That part changed the room in a different way. Some of the 32 already knew, their composure shifting indicated prior knowledge. Others didn't, and the quality of their not knowing resolved into something stark when the shape of it became clear. One of them must kill the other. Spoken before Harry was born, heard by Dumbledore, acted upon from the moment Harry survived. A child shaped around a prediction he was never told existed, toward a confrontation he was never told was coming, for a victory that Dumbledore believed Harry was necessary for but needed to be managed to achieve. "He believes it was the only way," Harry said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't think he's lying about his motivations. I think he genuinely believes he was protecting something larger than any one person's rights." He paused. "But that's not a defense. That's a description of the problem." He looked directly at the panel. "Every person who has ever decided that the ends justify doing things to children without their knowledge or consent has believed they were protecting something larger. That belief doesn't make it protection. It makes it easier to live with." The chamber was still. "I'm 11 years old," Harry said. "I've been at Hogwarts for 11 days. And I am standing here telling 32 members of the Wisengamot that the man who has led this chamber for 40 years spent my entire life deciding, on my behalf, what I was allowed to know and feel and be capable of." He let that sit. The question isn't whether his intentions were good. The question is whether anyone, with good intentions gets to do that. He looked one more time at Dumbledore. "The answer has to be no. Or it will always be yes, for the next person, and the one after that." He sat down. The chamber did not erupt. It stayed quiet, a different kind of quiet from the one that follows drama. The kind of quiet that follows something true. Then Marchbanks said, "The defense may present its witness." Crouch stood. "The defense calls Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore." Dumbledore took the chair. He sat in it with the composed gravity of a man who had made peace with what he was about to do. The chains didn't move. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at Marchbanks and waited. Crouch walked him through the preliminary elements, his history, his positions, the context of the war, with the practiced ease of prepared questioning. Dumbledore answered clearly, and the portrait it painted was true in the way that a carefully cropped image is true, nothing wrong with the part you can see, but the frame deliberately placed. Then Marchbanks said, "Professor Dumbledore, the prosecution has entered evidence documenting 34 memory blocks in Harry Potter's mind, all bearing your forensic magical signature. Do you deny placing those blocks?" Dumbledore looked out at the chamber. He looked at Harry. And the settled quality in his eyes did what Harry had predicted it would do. "No," he said. "I do not deny it." The gallery above exhaled. "I placed the blocks," Dumbledore said. "Beginning when Harry was 14 months old, following the defeat of Voldemort and my initial assessment of Harry's magical capacity." He paused. The assessment indicated a level of inherent magical power that I had never encountered in a living individual. Combined with the residual energy Harry absorbed from the rebounding killing curse, and combined with a prophecy I had knowledge of that indicated Harry would be the one individual capable of defeating Voldemort permanently, I determined that Harry required careful management from early life in order to reach that confrontation in a condition I could predict and prepare for. "Management," Marchbanks said flatly. "Guidance," Dumbledore said. "Of a kind that Harry, at that age, could not be consulted on. The blocks were intended to prevent Harry from developing abilities before he had the emotional and psychological maturity to manage them safely." "Who determined when that maturity would be sufficient?" Bones asked, not waiting for Marchbanks to redirect. Dumbledore turned to her. "I did," he said quietly. "Based on what criteria?" "Based on my assessment of the situation as it developed," Dumbledore said, and for the first time something shifted under the composed exterior, not defensiveness exactly, but the slight pressure of a man holding a position against increasing resistance. "The blocks were not permanent. They were always intended to be removed at the appropriate moment." "Which you would determine," Bones said. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "Without informing Harry, or any guardian, or any official oversight body?" "Yes." He held her gaze without flinching. "I understand how that sounds." "I want to explain, Professor Dumbledore," Bones said, and her voice was very level, very precise, very final. "You have just confirmed under oath that you unilaterally decided to suppress the cognitive development of a child for 11 years based on your personal assessment of strategic necessity, that this decision was made when the child was 14 months old, that the criteria for releasing those suppressions were known only to you, and that no oversight mechanism of any kind was applied to this decision at any point." She paused. "I have no further questions." The chamber was absolutely silent. Dumbledore sat in the chair with his hands folded in his lap and his expression the expression of a man who has said what he needed to say and cannot unsay it, and has known all along that saying it was necessary, and still believes. This was the part Harry could see from across the room, clear as a signature on 34 blocks, still believes that eventually, someone will understand. Harry looked at him and felt something that was not victory and not grief and not anger, though it contained elements of all three. He felt the thing that comes after, when something has been true for a long time and finally, publicly, is acknowledged as true. He felt the closing of a specific distance. Marchbanks called a deliberation recess at 3 in the afternoon. The chamber cleared into the antechambers and corridors, and the noise that had been contained inside for 7 hours was briefly, chaotically released into the stone hallways of the ministry. Harry stood with McGonagall and Bones and Tonks against the wall of the main corridor, and Ron and Hermione flanked him, and nobody said anything immediately, which was correct. Then Ron said, "You were brilliant." "The evidence was brilliant," Harry said. "Stop that," Hermione said, with the focused precision of someone who has limited patience for deflection. You were brilliant and the evidence was brilliant and both things are true. Harry allowed that. He leaned his head back against the stone wall and looked at the ceiling, and thought about Dumbledore in the witness chair, calm and certain and still explaining, and he thought about the quality of certainty that survives its own exposure, and he thought about what it meant that someone could do all of that and still believe they were right. He wasn't going to apologize, Harry said. No, McGonagall said. He still thinks he made the right calls. I know. Does that make the verdict matter more or less? Harry said. Not rhetorically. Actually asking. McGonagall thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. It makes the verdict necessary, she said finally. Whether he believes he was wrong or not is a question only he can answer, and his answer is his own to carry. What the Wisengamot decides determines what everyone else can do. What the law allows. She paused. That's what today is. Not his conversion. His accountability. Right, Harry said. Snape appeared at the far end of the corridor. Harry noticed him before anyone else did, or if the others noticed they chose not to react, which in McGonagall's case was certainly a choice. Snape walked toward them with the deliberate, controlled pace that Harry had decided was Snape's default mode of being, contained, purposeful, giving nothing away in his body that his face also wasn't giving away. He stopped in front of Harry. For a long moment he said nothing. Harry looked up at him and waited. He'd decided, somewhere in the middle of his recovery, that with Snape the correct approach was patience. Not deference, patience. They were different things. Your mother, Snape said, and then stopped, and the stopping was involuntary. Harry could see that it was involuntary, the word hitting something that cut the sentence off at the root. I know, Harry said quietly. Snape looked at him. The composure that he maintained as a matter of existential survival was doing an enormous amount of work in that moment, and Harry saw the effort of it and decided not to make that effort harder. She was the best person I knew, Snape said. 3 words at a time, carefully placed, like he was moving weight. She would, what was done to you, she would have. He stopped again. I know, Harry said again. And then, because it was true and because the recovered memories contained it and because Snape needed to hear it said directly, she trusted you. I know that. It's in what I remember about her. He held Snape's gaze. I'm not her. But I'm his by blood too, so I'm probably somewhere in between, and I think I'm capable of working out who you actually are rather than going by reputation. Snape was very still. I'm not asking for anything, Harry said. I'm telling you that I know, and that it's information I'm treating carefully. He paused. You should probably go back in. Deliberation recesses in these settings are usually short. Snape held his gaze for one more moment. Then he said, very quietly, you are remarkably unlike what I expected. The blocks are gone, Harry said. This is what I actually am. Something moved across Snape's face, deep and complicated and not quite readable, but in the general direction of the expression Harry had seen twice now in corridors and had been waiting to see properly. It was there longer this time. Long enough to catch. Then Snape turned and walked back down the corridor, and McGonagall made a small sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a word, and Ron looked at Harry with an expression of complete bewilderment that was also somehow fond. I never know what's happening when you talk to him, Ron said. Yes you do, Hermione said. You just find it uncomfortable. The recess bell sounded. They went back in. The deliberation took an hour and 40 minutes. Harry sat in the anteroom during it and didn't pace, didn't speculate aloud, didn't perform either anxiety or confidence. He sat with Ron on one side and Hermione on the other, and they talked about things that weren't the trial, Ron's brothers, Hermione's parents, the fact that Neville had apparently successfully grown an entire tray of mandrake seedlings in herbology on Friday when the rest of the class had managed 3 between them, which Sprout had reportedly described as, quote, rather impressive for a first attempt. Harry had smiled at that, genuinely, fully, the easy kind. At 5:17, the bell sounded again. They went back in. Harry took the seat behind the prosecution table this time. The witness chair sat empty in the center of the room. Marchbanks stood. On the charge of deliberate cognitive suppression of a minor under the Magical Child Welfare Act of 1953, as amended 1978, Section 7, Paragraph 2, the Wisingamot finds the defendant. She paused, and in the pause the chamber did not breathe. Guilty. The gallery erupted. Marchbanks raised her wand and the sound cut off as cleanly as a chord ending. Sentencing will be determined at a separate hearing, scheduled for the 14th. The defendant will remain in ministry custody pending that hearing. Additionally, the Wisingamot moves to formally review all decisions made under Dumbledore's authority as Chief Warlock over the past decade, with particular attention to cases involving the magical child welfare provisions. She looked at Bones. The supplementary documentation submitted by the prosecution will be incorporated into that review. Bones nodded. A small nod, clean and satisfied. Marchbanks looked at Harry. Just briefly, one direct look, held for perhaps 2 seconds. In it was something that, in another context, might have been an apology. The acknowledgement of a room that had allowed something to happen for a long time, finally stopping it. Harry held her gaze for the 2 seconds and nodded. Then he looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was looking at him. The composed exterior was intact, the bearing, the expression, all of it present and maintained. But in his eyes, the brilliant blue, the half-moon glasses perched above them, Harry saw what he'd suspected. Not defeat. Not anger. Not even the particular grief of the man who knows he was wrong. Conviction. Still there, quiet and absolute. I was right. Someday you'll know I was right. Harry looked at him and felt something clarify in him like water settling. No, Harry thought. I won't. He stood up. Around him the chamber was reorganizing itself into the next phase of the legal machinery, people standing, papers gathering, the apparatus of consequence beginning its work. McGonagall was beside him, steady as stonework. Bones was already speaking to a ministry official. Tonks was coordinating with the Aurors. Ron put his hand on Harry's shoulder, the same solid, unambiguous thump as on the first night at St. Mungo's. You all right? Yes, Harry said. And it was the most completely true answer he'd given to that question in 11 years. Hermione linked her arm through his and steered them toward the door with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided the next priority is getting out of this room and eating something. We should get back. Neville will want to know what happened. Yeah, Harry said. He will. They walked toward the door, out of the courtroom, through the anteroom, into the corridor where the rest of the ministry went about its ordinary complicated business, and Harry walked through it into the wider world that he now occupied differently, fully, in the shape of who he actually was. The conviction verdict was 1 day old. The sentencing was 2 weeks away. Voldemort was somewhere, dormant and patient. The war that the prophecy described was in the future, indeterminate in its timing and shape. There was a great deal left to do. Harry walked out of the Ministry of Magic into the cold November air and thought, good. Chapter 5, The Neville Thread. The sentencing hearing was set for the 14th, which gave Harry 9 days. He used them. The room of requirement became his second home, early mornings before breakfast, evenings after dinner, and on 2 occasions the full stretch of Saturday afternoon when the castle was half empty with students visiting Hogsmeade and the corridors had the particular quiet of a building breathing. He worked through the technique systematically, with the focused patience of someone who understands that brilliance without discipline is architecture without foundations, and who has 11 years of enforced smallness to convert into something precise and useful. The wandless work consolidated first. By the Thursday of that week he could execute any first or second-year level charm wandless with the clean reliability of breathing, and by the Friday the third-year charms followed. He wasn't attempting to go further yet, not because he couldn't, he suspected, but because consistency mattered more than maximum range, and he wanted the lower levels solid before he tested the ceiling. The ward construction was something else entirely. He spent 3 full sessions on it because it interested him, not academically, not strategically, but in the way that something interests you when it comes from somewhere deep and particular in you. His mother's technique, adapted and extended, built from instinct as much as from the theoretical framework his recovered memories provided. He was building things that shouldn't be possible at 11. He knew this because he'd checked the theoretical literature, cross-referenced against the standard curriculum, and confirmed that what he was doing was listed in the Newt-level texts as advanced postgraduate work. He didn't find this troubling. He found it useful. Hermione found it alternately thrilling and maddening, which was her natural response to most things that exceeded her current knowledge base, the thrill of encountering something extraordinary and the frustration of not yet knowing enough to fully understand it. "Walk me through the anchoring mechanism again," she said on Thursday evening, cross-legged on the floor of the room of requirement with a notebook on her knee, watching Harry construct a ward perimeter around a section of the room with the focused attention of someone taking extremely detailed field notes. "The anchor isn't a single point," Harry said, "not breaking concentration. Most ward theory treats the anchor as a fixed locus. You tie the ward to a physical location, a stone, a threshold, a specific geographic coordinate. That's why wards fail when the anchor is disturbed." He moved along the invisible perimeter, extending the structure. This approach distributes the anchor across the entire boundary simultaneously. Every point on the perimeter is equally an anchor, which means there's no single point of failure. "That's not in any text I've found," Hermione said. "My mother developed it," Harry said. "Or developed this version of it. The underlying principle goes back further, but nobody had applied it this way." "How did she develop it?" "Instinct first, theory second," Harry said. "She felt what the ward wanted to do and let it, and then worked backward to understand why it worked." He completed the perimeter and turned to face her. "Try to breach it." Hermione stood up and raised her wand and attempted 3 different counterward techniques in sequence, with the diligent thoroughness she brought to every practical exercise. The ward absorbed all 3 without perceptible strain. She lowered her wand. "Remarkable," she said, with the genuine focus of someone encountering a genuinely interesting problem. "Then, can you teach it?" Harry thought about this. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I can do it. Whether I can explain the instinct well enough to translate it into instruction, I don't know." "We should try," Hermione said, with the tone of someone closing a parenthetical and moving on. "Because if you can teach it, and if I can learn it, then we can document it, and then it's not dependent on you specifically. It becomes a technique that exists independently." She sat back down with her notebook. "Knowledge that only exists in one person is fragile. Knowledge that gets written down and shared is a weapon everyone can have," Harry said. "I was going to say safer," Hermione said, "but yes, also that." Ron, who had been lying on one of the room's conveniently provided sofas eating a biscuit with the equanimity of a spectator at a sporting event he finds genuinely entertaining, said, "Can you teach me the wandless thing first? The levitation one. I want to move things without my wand." "Why?" Hermione said. "Because it would be brilliant," Ron said, with irrefutable logic. Neville's court order came through on Wednesday. McGonagall told them at breakfast, told Harry specifically, meeting his eyes across the Gryffindor table and giving a single nod that communicated the essentials without requiring words. Harry excused himself from the rest of his toast and found Neville coming out of the dormitory stairs into the common room, still in pajamas, expression doing its default bracing. "Wednesday afternoon," Harry said. "St. Mungo's. The court order came through." Neville went very still. "Your Gran can object all she wants," Harry said. "The court order supersedes her consent. You don't need her permission." He paused, watching Neville's expression carefully. "This is yours. Your choice. Nobody else's." Neville's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance but in the particular expression of someone accommodating new information about their own sovereignty over themselves, which was a larger thing to adjust to than it might sound. He'd spent his entire life accommodating his grandmother's convictions about what he was and what he wasn't. What if the removal? Neville started. Then he stopped, and Harry could see him identifying the question he actually wanted to ask underneath the one he'd started with. What if I'm still not very good? After? Then you work harder than you did before, but at least you're working with everything you have instead of everything minus whatever they took, Harry said. But Neville, he paused. The blocks were on magical instinct and casting intuition. Those aren't things you develop. Those are things you either have or you don't. They were suppressed, which means you have them, and suppression isn't the same as absence. He held Neville's gaze. You have them. They've been there the whole time. Neville looked at him. The expression that crossed his face then was one Harry recognized from the inside, the specific quality of someone being given permission to believe something they've been told they weren't allowed to believe. The internal architecture of it shifting, slowly, towards something more honest. Okay, Neville said. Wednesday. Monday brought something Harry hadn't anticipated, which was a letter from Lucius Malfoy that was not a letter. The owl arrived during Transfiguration, which McGonagall stopped to note with the expression of a woman who was going to have strong words with the Ollery about timing, and the envelope it dropped on Harry's desk had the Malfoy seal, but when Harry opened it, the content was a single line of text that dissolved as he read it, leaving only the faint scent of something expensive and the clear impression that whoever had sent it wanted him to know the message was unsavable. The message said, "We should speak before the sentencing. The offer I am prepared to make will not survive exposure to the proceedings." Harry looked at the blank envelope. He turned it over. He put it in his folder. Then he raised his hand. "Professor McGonagall, can I speak to you after class?" McGonagall looked at the blank envelope, then at him. "Yes," she said. After class, in her office, he handed her the envelope and told her what the message had said. She read the blank envelope for a long moment, which was the look of someone who doesn't need evidence to know exactly who sent a thing and why. "Lucius Malfoy," she said. "Yes. He wants to offer you something in exchange for testimony modification," she said. "Or testimony absence, more likely. Possibly both." She set the envelope on her desk. "This needs to go to Bones." "I know," Harry said. "I was going to ask you to send it." He paused. "What does he want to protect?" McGonagall looked at him. "Malfoy has been a public supporter of Dumbledore's positions for years, institutionally, financially, politically. If Dumbledore's methods are discredited at the level the trial is discrediting them, some of what Malfoy has built his influence on becomes more difficult to defend." She paused. "There are also questions about Malfoy's conduct during Voldemort's war that have never been fully answered, and Dumbledore's authority as Chief Warlock was instrumental in certain determinations that protected certain individuals from scrutiny." She said this with the careful precision of someone choosing words that are accurate without being speculative. Harry looked at the blank envelope on her desk. "He's scared of what comes out in the review," Harry said. "The Wisengamot review of Dumbledore's decisions." McGonagall said nothing, which was confirmation. "Then the review matters more than I thought," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "It does." He paused at the door. "Don't let Bones respond to Malfoy before I talk to her," he said. "I want to know what he's offering before we decide how to handle it." McGonagall looked at him with the inventory expression. Then she said, "You are remarkably strategic for someone who has been unblocked for less than 2 weeks." "The blocks are gone," Harry said. "This is just how I think." Bones met him on Tuesday, in a small conference room at the Ministry that had the quality of a room used for conversations that don't need to be on any official agenda. She had the blank envelope in front of her and the expression of a woman who has anticipated a move like this and is interested in how to optimize the response. "His specific offer," she said, "came through a third-party intermediary to my office this morning." She slid a parchment across the table. "Financial settlement, the figure is significant. A formal acknowledgement of the harm you suffered, to be privately delivered, not public. And," she paused. A guarantee that the Wisengamot review of Dumbledore's decisions will exclude certain categories of wartime determination. The cases that protected him, Harry said. And others like him, Bones said. During the war, the imperious defense was applied with remarkable flexibility to individuals whose guilt was considerably more complicated than the defense implied. Dumbledore, in his capacity as chief warlock, had significant discretion over which cases received scrutiny and which didn't. She looked at him steadily. If the review is comprehensive and unfiltered, those decisions will be re-examined. Some of them will not survive re-examination. So what's in Malfoy's interest is not unique to Malfoy, Harry said. No. There's a category of people who benefited from Dumbledore's discretion during a period when that discretion was essentially unchecked, and who have very strong reasons to want the review to remain narrow. She folded her hands. Malfoy is the one who moved first, which tells me he's either the most nervous or the most accustomed to solving problems this way. Possibly both. Harry leaned back in his chair. He thought about the blank envelope and the dissolving message and the careful, expensive smell of it. He thought about Draco Malfoy at the Slytherin table, watching him with the concentrated calculation of someone who had been told his whole life that calculation was the appropriate response to everything. Turn it down, Harry said. The offer. Bones nodded, as though this was what she'd expected. And make the refusal on record, Harry said. Publicly. I want it known that the offer was made and refused, and why. Bones looked at him. That's aggressive. It's accurate, Harry said. If I accept a private settlement and allow the review to be narrowed, then in 5 years or 10 years when the next Malfoy does the next thing, they'll do it knowing that the right amount of money can make problems go away. He paused. I don't want to be the person who established that principle. Bones was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was with a quality of precision that Harry had come to recognize as her version of approval, restrained, calibrated, but present. I'll draft the refusal today, she said. On the record, with your name attached. Good, Harry said. Wednesday, St. Mungo's. Neville walked into the hospital with his shoulders pulled in and his jaw set and the air of someone who has made a decision and intends to see it through regardless of how uncomfortable the seeing through is. Harry walked beside him, and McGonagall walked ahead. She'd arranged everything, organized the transport, liaised with the healers, done all of it with the efficient competence of a woman who has decided something is going to happen and removed all obstacles to it happening. Harry had decided he wanted to be there, and McGonagall had not suggested otherwise. Hermione had written Neville a note that morning that she'd handed to him at breakfast with the slightly formal manner she adopted when she was being sincere and didn't want it to be mistaken for something else. Harry hadn't read it, but he'd watched Neville read it and he'd watched what happened to Neville's expression as he read it, and he'd thought, she knows exactly what to say to people. She just sometimes presents it in the wrong format. Voss was the healer, the same one, which Harry appreciated. She ran through the same preliminary questions with the same brisk, person-treating clarity she'd used on Harry, and she explained the removal process with the same honesty about what it would feel like, which Neville listened to with focused attention and a jaw that was getting progressively more set. Harry sat in the chair against the wall. He didn't say anything during the procedure. He was just there. He'd understood, from his own experience, that the most useful thing anyone had done for him in that room was stay, McGonagall, keeping her fixed-point quality in the chair, the steadiness of someone committed to witnessing. He intended to do the same thing for Neville. The first block came down and Neville made a small, involuntary sound, not pain, something more like the sound of a breath you hadn't realized you were holding. The second block, and Neville's hands came together on his knees, gripping his own fingers. The third block, and his eyes went somewhere interior, the particular quality of inward attention that Harry recognized, the first moments of seeing a room you'd forgotten existed, and the inventory of what was in it. Fourth, fifth, sixth. When Voss confirmed the last block was clear, Neville sat in the chair for a full minute and said nothing. The silence had the quality of someone turning something very large and examining all its sides. Harry didn't break it. Then Neville said, quietly, I knew how to do the switching spell. Harry waited. I've been trying to learn the switching spell all week, Neville said. It's next month's curriculum. I was trying to get ahead, and I couldn't, it wouldn't, he stopped. Breathed. I can feel how to do it now. I couldn't an hour ago and I can now. He looked at his hands. It's just there. Yes, Harry said. 6 blocks, Neville said. 6 things he took. 6 things he took, Harry confirmed. Neville's expression was doing several things at once, the recognition, the grief, the specific complicated feeling of something being given back that should never have been taken, and underneath all of it a quality that Harry identified after a moment as anger. Clean and appropriate and directed correctly. Why did he do it? Neville said. Mine aren't about a prophecy. I wasn't, he didn't need me for anything specifically, I don't think. Why would he? Control of the narrative, Harry said. He'd been thinking about this since the detection charm had flagged Neville. He needed the wizarding world to have a specific story about the war and the people in it. A clear hero, a clear structure, a clear answer to what happens next. If you were clearly capable, if people could see what you could do, the story gets more complicated. Are you the hero? Are you an alternative? Do people start asking questions about the prophecy, about who it referred to, about the choices Dumbledore made? He paused. It was tidier for him if you just faded into background. Weren't remarkable. Let the story stay simple. Neville stared at him. He suppressed me to keep the story clean, he said. I think so, Harry said. Neville was very still for a long moment. Then he said, that's, he stopped. Started again. I spent 6 years thinking my gran was right. That I just wasn't, that I was the family disappointment, the one who got the magic but not the talent, the one who, he pressed his lips together. She told me, after my parents, she told me I had to work twice as hard as anyone else just to be half as good, because I didn't have the natural ability they did. His voice was controlled in the way that controlled things are controlled when the alternative is cracking. She believed that. She really believed that. And I believed her. And it was because someone decided, yes, Harry said. Quietly. Without adding to it or around it. The word alone, confirming the thing, not trying to frame it or soften it. Neville exhaled. A long, uneven breath. He's going to hear about this, Harry said. At the sentencing. I'm going to make sure of it. Neville looked at him. I'm not a victim, he said, and the firmness in it was new, not the braced defensiveness of before but something that had already begun to stand differently. I know you're not, Harry said. But you are someone with standing in this case, and what happened to you expands the picture. It shows that what Dumbledore did wasn't specific to me, it was a pattern. A policy. He held Neville's gaze. That matters. Neville thought about this. Then, I want to testify. Then you should, Harry said. Thursday, the parchment arrived. It came not by owl but by Ministry interdepartmental delivery, the kind that appears at the recipient's location directly rather than through any observable transit, and it landed on Harry's desk in the middle of charms with a faint pop that made Flitwick pause mid-demonstration and look over with an expression of resigned professionalism. Harry opened it. It was from the Department of Mysteries. Not the full text of the prophecy, he hadn't expected that, the full text was sealed in the Hall of Prophecy and wasn't transmitted by interdepartmental mail. What it was, instead, was a formal notice from the Unspeakables confirming the existence of orb number 97 in the Hall of Prophecy, registered to the subjects T.M. Riddle and H.J. Potter, created by seer Sybil Trelawney in the year 1979, and heard in its entirety by A.P.W.B. Dumbledore. At the bottom, in the neutral font of official ministry correspondence, was a single additional line: the contents of this orb are available for court-ordered viewing by named subjects upon application. Harry read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his folder and spent the rest of charms doing the exercises with the partial attention of someone whose mind is working the problem. After class, Hermione fell into step beside him. She'd clearly read the parchment over his shoulder. She read everything. It wasn't an invasion, it was an instinct. Court-ordered viewing, she said. Yes. 4 named subjects. I'm a named subject, Harry said. Riddle is, presumably, not accessible, which makes me the only named subject currently capable of applying. He paused. I want to know exactly what it says. Why? Hermione said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Trying to understand what he wanted to do with the information. Because it's mine, Harry said. It's a prophecy about my life and I've spent 11 years not knowing it existed. I want to know exactly what was used to justify what was done to me. He paused. And because if I know the exact wording, I can make my own assessment of what it means. Not Dumbledore's interpretation. Mine. Hermione was quiet for a moment. What if the exact wording is worse than Dumbledore's interpretation? Then I'll know that, Harry said. And I'll make a plan accordingly. But at least it'll be my plan. She nodded slowly. We should apply today. Harry said. You'll need a witness, she said. Someone with enough knowledge of the relevant legal framework to ensure the application is filed correctly and that the terms of the court order are properly stated. She looked at him. I've been reading the relevant sections of the Department of Mysteries oversight provisions since Thursday morning. Harry almost smiled. Of course you have. Do you want the application filed correctly or not? Filed correctly, please, Harry said. The application went to Bones, who signed off on the court order within 24 hours, which was either expedience or her particular brand of decisive certainty about what mattered. The viewing was scheduled for Saturday, the day before the sentencing hearing, at the Department of Mysteries, with Bones present as the presiding legal authority and Tonks as security. Friday, Harry found Snape. He went to the potions classroom after dinner, when the dungeons had emptied and the castle was settling into the quieter rhythms of evening. He knocked on the office door, which was something he'd thought about doing several times since Monday and had finally decided there was no useful reason to delay further. Come in, Snape said, from inside. Harry came in. Snape's office was the way Snape was, precise, dense, nothing present that wasn't purposeful. Shelves of ingredients, bottles of things he'd been working on, parchment in neat stacks. Snape was behind his desk with a student essay in front of him and a quill in his hand and the expression of a man who was expecting to see a student and was recalibrating rapidly at the sight of Harry. Mr. Potter, he said. I wanted to talk to you about something, Harry said. He sat in the chair across the desk without being invited, which was either rude or efficient depending on your perspective. About the case. Not the block removal, that's settled. About the Wisengamot review. Snape set the quill down. He looked at Harry with the focused attention that he deployed in place of more conventional expressions of interest. The review of Dumbledore's decisions. Yes. Harry met his gaze steadily. You were a Death Eater. You were cleared of charges after the war in a proceeding that Dumbledore had significant influence over. That proceeding is likely to come under review. Snape was very still. I'm not accusing you of anything, Harry said. I have my mother's memories of you, fragmentary but clear enough to give me a picture. I know why you changed sides. I know what that cost. He paused. And I know that a broad-spectrum review of the wartime proceedings might not distinguish between people who were genuinely innocent and people who had the right protectors. Snape said, after a long moment, What is it you want, Mr. Potter? Nothing, Harry said. I'm not here to offer you a deal or extract a promise. I'm here because you knew my mother and because she trusted you and because I'd rather you hear this from me than from a ministry letter. He paused. If the review goes where it might go, you should have legal representation. Good representation. Not someone Malfoy recommends and not someone the ministry appoints. He looked at him. I'm saying this because I think it's the right thing to say, not because I want something from you. Snape was very still for a very long time. When he spoke his voice was low and stripped of the usual layers it carried, the professional authority, the deliberate intimidation, the carefully maintained distance. What was underneath all of that was quieter and considerably older. Your mother would have done exactly this, he said. Found the person who needed the information and gone directly to them without agenda. I know, Harry said. I've been trying to do more of that. He stood. That's all I came to say. Potter, Snape said, as Harry reached the door. Harry turned. For what it's worth, Snape paused. The expression was there again, the deep, complicated, grief-adjacent thing. I am sorry. For the years. For what was done. He held Harry's gaze. I couldn't have stopped it. I didn't know the full scope. But I suspected, on occasion, that not everything Dumbledore presented me with was the full picture. And I chose not to ask the questions that would have confirmed it. He paused. I told myself it was because asking would compromise the mission. The real reason was simpler than that. Another pause. I was afraid of what the answers would mean. Harry looked at him for a moment. You're telling me now, he said. Yes. Then it counts for something, Harry said. That's the only accounting system I have. He left. Saturday, the Department of Mysteries. The Department of Mysteries was underground and strange in the way that places are strange when they've been dedicated to a specific purpose for a very long time and the purpose has seeped into the walls. It was quiet in a way that wasn't merely the absence of sound but the presence of something else, a quality of contained possibility, of things held carefully at specific temperatures. The unspeakable who met them said nothing, which was appropriate given the department name, and led them through corridors that changed direction in ways Harry's spatial sense tracked and filed and understood were intentional rather than disorienting. Bones walked beside him. Tonks followed. Hermione had wanted to come and Harry had said yes, because he wanted the witnessing and because he trusted her comprehension of what she'd see. The Hall of Prophecy was tall and dark, filled with rows of shelves reaching toward a ceiling that disappeared into shadow, each shelf carrying hundreds of glass orbs in the dim, dusty light. Each orb glowing faintly, a life inside it, a future or a fear or both. The unspeakable stopped at a specific shelf and indicated orb number 97 with a gesture. Harry reached up and took it. The orb was cold in his hand. Lighter than it looked. The glow inside it was pale and steady, and as his fingers closed around it he felt, not magic exactly, but the residue of magic, old and specific and intentional. He looked at it. Then he looked at Hermione. Then at Bones. Ready? Bones said. Yes, Harry said. He held the orb in both hands and the glow intensified, and the voice that came from it was thin and strange, the voice of a person speaking in a trance state, every word falling with the specific quality of something that was not being said but revealed. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the seventh month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the seventh month dies. The glow faded. The hall was silent. Harry stood holding the orb, listening to the specific quality of the silence that follows something that has been contained for a long time and has finally been heard by the person it was spoken for. He turned it over in his mind. The actual words, not Dumbledore's interpretation. The actual structure of it. The one with the power to vanquish. Not the one who will die trying. Not the one who will be a tool. The one with the power. Present tense, inherent, already there. He will have power the Dark Lord knows not. Not power that needs to be rationed, or revealed at the correct moment, or managed by a keeper who decides when the wielder is ready. Power that exists. Power that is already his. Either must die at the hand of the other. One of them had to kill the other. That was true. But the prophecy said nothing about how it happened or when or under what conditions. It said nothing about a boy kept small and uncertain walking into a situation engineered by someone else. It said nothing about whose hands held the wand or whose understanding of the situation was complete. It said the one with the power would vanquish him. Harry had the power. It had been there from the start. He put the orb back on its shelf. Well? Hermione said. I can work with that, Harry said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the orb on its shelf. Then back at him. You're not frightened, she said. Not a question. No, Harry said. The prophecy says one of you has to kill the other, she said. Yes. And you're not, Hermione, Harry said. He killed my parents when I was 14 months old. He's been dormant for 10 years and he's going to come back, and the prophecy says I'm the one with the power to stop him. He looked at the orb on its shelf, steady and pale in the dark of the hall. I'm not frightened of that. I'm preparing for it. There's a difference. She held his gaze. The specific quality of her understanding when she understood something completely moved across her face. Right, she said, quietly. Yes. Bones, who had been observing this exchange with the calibrated stillness of someone collecting information rather than interjecting into it, said, this comes up at tomorrow's sentencing. I know, Harry said. All of it. The prophecy, Neville, Malfoy's offer, the systematic welfare suppression, all of it. He turned toward the exit of the hall. I want the full picture in that room. It will make Dumbledore's sentence heavier, Bones said. Good, Harry said. Sunday morning, the sentencing. It was a different chamber from the trial, smaller, more focused, less theater. The full Wisengamot wasn't present, just the sentencing panel, Marchbanks, for members, and a ministry legal representative. Dumbledore was at the defendant's table. His legal team was smaller today. Crouch was there, but one of the associates was gone, which might mean nothing or might mean that the Malfoy connection had become a liability worth distancing. Harry sat in the witness chair again. He was getting familiar with it. He presented the new evidence clearly. The Neville blocks, 6 installations, same signature, in a child who had no prophecy connection, no strategic necessity, no rationale beyond narrative management. He explained what Hermione's research had found about the welfare oversight suppression. He described Malfoy's offer and his refusal of it. He did not describe the prophecy in detail. Bones had advised that revealing its full contents in an open hearing was strategically inadvisable given the implications for Voldemort's remaining allies, and Harry had agreed. But he confirmed its existence, confirmed Dumbledore's knowledge of it, and confirmed that it had been the documented rationale for the earliest and most extensive blocks. Neville testified after him. He walked to the witness chair with his shoulders back, a new quality in the posture, something that had started Wednesday at St. Mungo's and had been consolidating since. He sat down and he spoke clearly, without the apologetic undertow that usually ran beneath everything he said. He told the panel about 6 years of believing he was inadequate. About his grandmother's conviction that he needed to work twice as hard. About the herbology talent that had always been there, the magical intuition that had begun to emerge since Wednesday's removal, the first year of school he'd spent feeling behind and puzzled by the gap between his effort and his results. He said, I didn't know what was normal because I'd never experienced it. I thought this was just what it felt like to be me. He paused. It wasn't. The panel was very quiet. Marchbanks asked Dumbledore for his response to the new evidence regarding Neville. Dumbledore sat at the defendant's table with his hands flat on the surface and his face wearing the expression that Harry had come to think of as his deep-water face, the profound, patient blue of someone looking up from the bottom of a very long decision they made a long time ago. The intervention regarding Mr. Longbottom, he said, was made to prevent confusion about the nature of the prophecy. Both Harry and Neville were candidates for the role described. It was important that there be no ambiguity. No parallel track. No complication to the clarity of the path I believed Harry needed to walk. He paused. I made the assessment that clarity of destiny, singular, unambiguous, would serve the outcome better than the distraction of two possibilities. You made the assessment, Marchbanks said. Yes. That Neville Longbottom's potential should be suppressed to prevent his existence from complicating your narrative, Marchbanks said. I would not characterize, Professor Dumbledore. Marchbanks's voice was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years on this bench and was experiencing something she'd never quite expected to experience. You blocked a second child. A child with no specific strategic role. A child who was suppressed not because he was dangerous or required management, but because his existence as a capable, talented wizard complicated a story you were telling. She held his gaze. That is not a wartime decision. That is not an act of protection. That is an act of authorship. Dumbledore said nothing. You were writing a story, Marchbanks said. And you required the characters to behave as written. The chamber was absolutely still. Harry watched Dumbledore's face. He watched the deep-water composure. He watched the quality of decision that had been there since Thursday. He watched, and what he saw, finally, under all of it, past the conviction and the genuine love for the world he'd been trying to protect, past the strategy and the 40 years of being the smartest person in every room, was something he hadn't expected. Recognition. For just a moment, one moment, Dumbledore looked at Marchbanks and something in his face acknowledged it. The precision of the word. Authorship. Not protection. Not strategy. Not the greater good. Authorship. He'd been writing a story. And he'd needed the characters to follow the plot. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the deep water quality returned and it was gone. But Harry had seen it. He looked down at his hands in his lap. He thought about the word, the way Marchbanks had placed it in the room. He thought about 11 years as a character in someone else's narrative, shaped and suppressed and positioned, the boy who lived made to live in exactly the way that served the author's vision. He thought about the room of requirement. The wandless work. The wards. The 3 hours on Saturday of being exactly and completely himself. He thought about Neville in the witness chair, shoulders back. He thought about Hermione's parchment with its interconnected circles, mapping the pattern. He thought about Ron's hand on his shoulder, the solid, unambiguous thump of someone who chose to be there. He thought about McGonagall saying yours. Not Destiny's. Not the prophecies. Not Dumbledore's design. Yours. He looked up. Marchbanks was reviewing the sentencing panel's notes. Bones was watching the process with precise attention. Dumbledore was looking at his own hands. Harry sat in the witness chair in a room that had just had something true said in it, and felt the specific quality of a chapter ending, not a story ending, a chapter. The next one was different. He could feel the shape of it already, the different kind of work it would require, the different kind of clarity. Not Dumbledore's story. His. He was ready. Chapter 6, What Comes After the Sentence came down at noon. Marchbanks read it in the same level, carrying voice she used for everything, and the chamber received it in the same quality of weighted silence that had become the characteristic atmosphere of these proceedings, a room full of people who understood they were inside something that would be referenced for decades. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore was stripped of all official positions. Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, gone. Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, gone. Headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, gone. The positions enumerated one by one with the deliberate pace of a woman who understood that each one was a pillar and that dismantling them required acknowledgement of what they'd held up. Beyond the positions, mandatory registration with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Annual reviews. No authority over any minor, in any capacity, for the remainder of his life. A substantial financial restitution to be held in trust for both Harry and Neville until they came of age, administered by Gringotts rather than any ministry-affiliated body, Bones had insisted on that last detail, and Marchbanks had agreed with the efficiency of someone who understood why. No Azkaban. That had been the question Harry had been sitting with since the guilty verdict, and the answer Marchbanks gave was the one he'd expected after thinking about it carefully. Azkaban was for people the wizarding world needed to be protected from, and Dumbledore, old, stripped of authority, genuinely unlikely to construct another decade-long block program from a position of zero institutional power, was not that. What he was someone whose capacity to make unilateral decisions about other people's lives had been permanently curtailed, and that curtailment was the sentence. Harry thought it was probably right. He also thought it felt insufficient. He sat with both things simultaneously and decided that was acceptable, that real accountability rarely produced the clean emotional resolution that punishment was supposed to provide, and that expecting it to was its own kind of magical thinking. Dumbledore stood when the sentence was read and received it with the bearing of a man who had known it was coming and had not, in the end, run from it. He looked once at Harry, directly, across the chamber. Harry looked back. He thought about the 2 seconds on Sunday when recognition had moved across Dumbledore's face. He thought about whether that recognition had taken root or whether it had been noted and refiled under the heading of what people need to believe, to be managed like everything else. He genuinely didn't know, and he thought that was probably appropriate. Dumbledore was not a simple thing to know. What he knew was this: the man in front of him was diminished not because he'd lost titles but because the thing those titles had enabled, the unaccountable certainty, the authority to shape other lives unilaterally, was gone, and without it something essential to the way he'd operated for 40 years was simply not available to him anymore. Dumbledore without the architecture of his influence was still brilliant. Still capable of genuine love. Still convinced, on some level, that he understood the world more clearly than the people in it. But he couldn't act on it without being seen. And being seen, Harry understood, was the thing he'd spent 40 years carefully preventing. The Aurors came for Dumbledore. Not dramatically, no binding, no performance of consequence. Just the presence of official authority, and Dumbledore walking between them toward the door with the dignity of someone who has decided to wear whatever comes with grace. At the door he paused, briefly, and said something to the Auror on his left that Harry couldn't hear, and then he walked through it, and he was gone. The chamber began to reorganize itself into the world without him. Harry didn't go back to Hogwarts immediately. McGonagall had arranged for a few hours at the Ministry, a meeting with Bones about the ongoing review, some paperwork that apparently attached to being the central figure in a historic Wisengamot proceeding, and the specific administrative task of confirming that the Gringotts trust arrangement was properly established. The paperwork occupied a side room off the main corridor, and Harry sat through it with the patient attention of someone who understands that the boring infrastructure of consequences is as important as the consequences themselves, and signed what needed signing, and asked the questions that needed asking, and left with everything in the right state. While he was signing the Gringotts documents, an owl arrived. Not a letter, a small package, the size of a book, wrapped in brown paper with a seal he didn't recognize. He opened it at the table, the Ministry official watching with the professionally neutral expression of someone pretending not to be curious. Inside was a photograph. Not a magical photograph. A Muggle one, old, printed on the kind of paper that's slightly too thick, with the white border that older prints have. In it, 2 people stood in what looked like a garden, summer light on their faces, laughing at something outside the frame. The woman had red hair and the man had glasses and dark untidy hair, and they were leaning toward each other with the easy, habitual closeness of people who have been in each other's orbit long enough to not think about the distance between them. Harry looked at it for a long time. There was no note. No explanation of who had sent it. He thought about that for a moment, turning over the possible senders, the short list of people who would have access to this specific image, in this specific medium, and arrived at the only name that made sense. The only person in Dumbledore's circle who had known his mother personally, who knew where this photograph existed, and who had sat across a desk from Harry 6 days ago and said your mother would have done exactly this. He put the photograph carefully in the inner pocket of his robes, against his chest, and went back to signing the Gringotts documents. The ride back to Hogwarts was by Ministry car, 3 of them, black and somehow both official and unremarkable, the way Ministry transport managed to be. Harry sat in the second one with McGonagall, and Ron and Hermione were in the third with Tonks, and for the first 20 minutes nobody in Harry's car said anything, which suited him. The November countryside moved past the windows, grey-green fields under a sky that couldn't decide between cloud and clear, the kind of afternoon that didn't make strong opinions. Harry watched it and thought about the photograph in his pocket. "What happens to Hogwarts now?" he said. McGonagall was looking at the window on her side. She turned her head. "The Board of Governors will appoint an interim headmaster," she said. "I've been asked to serve in that capacity until a permanent appointment is made." "You said yes," Harry said. "Not a question." Something crossed her expression, not pride exactly, more the quality of someone who has been given back a thing they'd set down long ago. "Provisionally," she said. "I've told the board that my priority is the students and the academic functioning of the school, and that I won't be Dumbledore's replacement in the broader political sense. I'm not taking on the external positions, the Wisengamot role, none of that. I'm running the school." "That sounds right," Harry said. She looked at him. "The review is going to be disruptive," she said. "For the school specifically. Some of the administrative decisions that will be re-examined were directly relevant to Hogwarts, staffing choices, curriculum, certain arrangements that Dumbledore made on behalf of the school without full board oversight." She paused. "There may be changes. Changes you support or changes that happen to you?" Harry asked. "Some of both," she said. "Navigating the difference is part of the work." She looked back at the window. "I've also been speaking to the board about the detection charm protocol," it will continue. "Annual screenings for all students, not just first years, until the backlog of potentially affected students has been assessed." Harry thought about this. "How many others do you think there might be?" "I don't know," she said. "I hope very few. I expect more than one." She paused. "The review will tell us." The car was quiet for a moment. "He made recommendations about students for 40 years, Harry said. Influenced who was placed where, what opportunities went to who, what assessments were given, which students were flagged as exceptional versus overlooked. He thought about all the components of Dumbledore's influence, how comprehensively it had occupied the structures around him. Some of that is going to be an enormous mess to unpick. "Yes," McGonagall said simply. "You'll manage it," Harry said. She looked at him, and the inventory quality was there but softer than it had been that first night in the Great Hall, less assessment, more something that had arrived at a conclusion it was comfortable with. "Probably," she said, which was as close to confident as McGonagall got, and which therefore meant completely certain. The castle appeared on the horizon in the way it always did, suddenly, around a bend in the road, as if it had been waiting just out of sight and chosen this moment to reveal itself. Late afternoon light was sitting on the towers at an angle that made the stone look almost warm, and the lake below the grounds was still, and the forest was the forest, dark and permanent. Harry looked at it and felt the thing he'd been slowly identifying for 11 days, the specific quality of a place becoming real to you. Not just known, but real. Hogwarts had been extraordinary to him from the moment he'd seen it, but extraordinary and real were different categories, and the becoming real was quieter and deeper and more durable. He was going to be here for 7 years. Learning, building, developing the architecture of what he was capable of into something refined and purposeful. He was 11 years old and fully himself for the first time, and he had 7 years and a school and friends who had chosen to be here, and the prophecy was a fact, but it was his fact, held in his own hands, to be approached on his own terms. That was enough. More than enough. It was actually, if he thought about it clearly, extraordinary. The car stopped at the gates. They walked up the path in the evening air, McGonagall slightly ahead, and the castle doors opened before they reached them, warm light spilling out. The great hall at dinner that evening was full. Harry walked in with Ron and Hermione, and the usual thing happened, the attention, the awareness of being watched, but it was a different quality of attention now than it had been 11 days ago. Not the celebrity watching of the first night, not the complicated watchfulness of the days after the arrest. This was something else. More considered, more specific, with the quality of attention that people give to someone they're in the process of understanding. He sat down. Food appeared. He ate. Neville was 2 seats down and he was eating with the slightly distracted air of someone who has spent the last several days having his internal landscape rearranged and is still mapping the new topography. He'd been in the room of requirement with Harry on Saturday morning, the first time they'd trained together, and the thing that had emerged in that session had been significant. Not at Harry's level, not close, but the underlying capacity was there and it was real and it was clearly relieved to finally be used. Neville had moved through 4 charms with the ease of someone discovering that a door they'd been pushing against for years was actually designed to pull, and the expression on his face as each one worked had been something Harry intended to remember for a long time. "How are you feeling?" Harry said. Neville looked up from his plate. "Odd," he said. "Like I keep reaching for something that isn't there anymore, except actually it is there and the surprise is that it works." He paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," Harry said. "That's the blocks. It takes a while for your reflexes to catch up with your actual capabilities. You spent years bracing against things that were harder than they should have been, your body is still bracing even though it doesn't need to." Neville thought about this. "My gran is angry," he said. "She old this morning. She said the court order was an overreach, that there was nothing wrong with me that application couldn't fix, that the whole thing has been politically motivated." He stopped. Turned the fork over in his hand. "And I wrote back and told her I disagreed." Harry looked at him. She's not wrong about everything," Neville said, with the careful honesty of someone who loves someone complicated. "She loves me. She was doing what she thought was right. But she was wrong about this and I told her so." He paused. "First time I've told her I disagree with something." He half smiled, a small, slightly rueful thing. It was terrifying and also completely fine. "Most things are," Harry said. Hermione found him in the library after dinner with the expression she wore when she'd been organizing something for a while and had finally reached the point where she could present it cleanly. She sat down across from him and put a single piece of parchment on the table. "What is this?" Harry said. "A curriculum," she said. "Not Hogwarts curriculum. An additional one. For you specifically, for things that aren't covered in the standard 7-year program at the level you need." She pushed it toward him. "I've been thinking about the gap between where you currently are and where the formal curriculum will take you, and the gap it's significant, Harry, you're going to be bored in the first 3 years at minimum if we don't, Hermione," Harry said. She stopped. "Did you make yourself a version of this too?" he said. She blinked. It's about your specific needs, did you?" A pause. "Yes," she admitted. "I made one for myself too. And a slightly less aggressive one for Neville that I thought we could work through together, if he's interested." She paused. "And possibly one for Ron, though I expect he'll have opinions about the density of it." "He'll complain about it and do all of it," Harry said. "Yes, that's my assessment too," she said. Harry looked at the parchment. It was detailed and thorough and clearly the product of several days of serious thought, a genuine curriculum, the kind that had been built by someone who understood not just the subject matter but the specific person who was going to be studying it. He could see the thought she'd put into the structure of it, the way it built incrementally, the places where she'd factored in what he already knew and was working forward from there. "This is brilliant," he said. She absorbed this with the slight formality she used for compliments she was genuinely pleased by. "I know," she said. "But thank you." Harry picked it up and looked at the first 3 items. Advanced Elemental Theory. Ward Construction Theory and Application. Magical History with emphasis on preministry developments. All things he had significant foundation in from his recovered memories, all things that could be built considerably further. "We start tomorrow," he said. "I was hoping Saturday," she said. Monday for the formal version, when we can use the room consistently. Saturday, Harry agreed. She nodded and took the parchment back to make a note on it, and Harry watched her write with the small focused energy she gave to things she cared about, and thought about the specific, irreplaceable quality of someone who sees what you need and builds it for you without being asked, without agenda, purely because it's the right thing and they can. He thought, I have this. He meant people, in general, this specific configuration of people who had found each other in 11 days and chosen each other without any of the calculated management that had characterized every previous relationship in his life. No one had placed them, no one had engineered the dynamic, no one had decided what Harry needed in friends and provided it strategically. They'd just arrived, all of them, at the table in the library and the bench in the courtyard and the room of requirement and the ministry corridor, and chosen to be there. It was the most significant thing about the last 11 days and also the quietest. He suspected it would continue to be both. The letter from the Dursleys arrived on Tuesday. He knew it was from them before he opened it. Vernon's handwriting was as identifiable as a personality disorder, large and forceful and somehow aggressive even in the formation of individual letters. Harry opened it at the Gryffindor table with the calm of someone who has recalibrated their relationship to this particular source of authority. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph was about the inconvenience of the ministry owl arriving at Privet Drive and what the neighbors had thought. The second paragraph was about the unacceptable intrusion of legal proceedings into the Dursley household and what Petunia's nerves had been through. The third paragraph said, in language that was trying very hard to be formal and landing in something closer to petulant, that they expected Harry to conduct himself properly and not drag the family name through any further. It used the word unnaturalness twice. Harry folded it, put it in his pocket, and looked at his eggs. Ron, watching this process, said, "Bad." "Standard," Harry said. Hermione looked at him with careful attention. "There's a social services provision under Muggle law that, I know," Harry said. "And under magical law there's a formal welfare review process that Bones has already initiated in relation to the Dursley placement." He paused. "I'm not going back there. That's settled. I'll spend school holidays here, or with," he paused, thinking about the canvas bag by the hospital room door, the large rounded handwriting, the chicken. "Probably with the Weasleys, if Mrs. Weasley's offer stands." "It stands," Ron said immediately, with the comfortable certainty of someone who knows his mother's offers as well as he knows his own instincts. "Mum would have gone to get you herself by now if McGonagall hadn't specifically asked her to let the legal process run." "Tell her I appreciate the restraint," Harry said. "I'll tell her nothing of the sort, she'll think restraint was the wrong call and immediately come get you anyway," Ron said. "I'll tell her you're grateful for the timing." "That works," Harry said. Wednesday, Snape's potions class. The class had settled into a dynamic over the past 2 weeks that was not warm. Harry didn't think Snape and warm were terms that would ever occupy the same space naturally, but was something more interesting. Snape taught at full capacity and expected the same in return, and Harry met that expectation without effort and then, on occasion, exceeded it, and what developed between them was the particular kind of mutual regard that emerges between two people who are both too honest to pretend competence they don't have and too specific to accept substitutes. The other students had noticed. The Gryffindors were confused by the absence of the contempt Snape deployed with reliable thoroughness on everyone else. The Slytherins, led by Draco Malfoy's concentrated observation, were trying to categorize what they were seeing and weren't quite managing it. Draco had been watching Harry with undiminished focus since the first day, with the expression of a boy who has been given very firm coordinates for how the world works and is encountering something that doesn't fit those coordinates and is unsure whether to revise the map or question the coordinates. On Wednesday, after potions, Draco fell into step beside Harry in the corridor. Harry didn't stop or slow down, which meant Draco had to match his pace, which was probably not how Draco had imagined the conversation beginning. "Potter," Draco said. "Malfoy," Harry said. A pause in which Draco appeared to be reformulating something. "My father's business with Bones," he said. "The offer. The refusal." "Yes," Harry said. "That was your decision," Draco said. Not quite a question. Yes, Harry said. Another pause. Most people would have taken the settlement, Draco said, with the tone of someone stating an observed fact rather than making an argument. I know, Harry said. I'm not most people. He glanced at Draco as they walked. Is there something specific you want to say, or are we doing the version where you establish context before the actual question? Draco's expression flickered, a brief, involuntary recalibration, similar to what Harry had seen in Dumbledore's face on Sunday, though considerably less consequential. He was, Harry thought, more interesting than the coordinates he'd been given suggested. The calculation was there, genuine and sharp, but underneath it was the actual person doing the calculating, and that person was watching Harry with something that wasn't quite respect but was in the neighborhood. The review, Draco said. It's going to go after the wartime proceedings. Yes, Harry said. My father's cases specifically. Among others. Draco was quiet for a moment, maintaining the pace. He wasn't under the imperius, he said. Very quietly. Not offering it as a defense, offering it as information, with the specific quality of someone saying something true that costs them something. Harry looked at him. Draco's jaw was set and his eyes were forward and he was moving with the contained, slightly rigid bearing of someone who has said a thing they can't unsay and has decided to see it through. He chose what he chose, Draco said. The defense was, it was what Dumbledore's arrangement allowed. It wasn't accurate. Why are you telling me this? Harry said. Because you're going to find out anyway, Draco said. And because, he stopped. The pause was longer than the previous ones. Because the version where someone tells you the truth before you find it out is better than the version where you find it out and assume the worst about what it means for everyone connected to him. He looked at Harry for the first time since they'd started walking. I am not my father. Harry held his gaze for a moment. He thought about what this was, not quite an allegiance, not an apology, not quite anything with a standard category. It was a person in the process of deciding who they were going to be, and choosing to do that deciding in front of Harry specifically. I know you're not, Harry said. I didn't assume otherwise. Draco blinked. The review will find what it finds, Harry said. What happens to your father is determined by what he did, not by who his son is. He paused. I think you already know that. I think that's why you're here. Draco looked at him for a long moment. The calculation was still there but it was doing something different, not assessing angles, not managing approach, but simply looking at Harry with the directness of someone who has run out of strategic intermediaries and is seeing what's actually in front of them. You're strange, Potter, Draco said. Probably, Harry said. They parted at the next corridor junction and Harry walked toward Transfiguration and thought about what had just happened with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that were in Claude's Sonnet 4.